Good morning and welcome everyone to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's seventh meeting of 2021. Our first agenda item today is an evidence session on the environmental implications following the UK's exit from the European Union. And we'll hear from a panel of experts first and then a panel of regulators after that. I'd like to welcome our first panel today. We have Professor Colin Reid from the University of Dundee, Dr. Verweer from Queen's University Belfast, Professor Campbell Gemmell, Consulting Partner for Campus Scotland and a Visiting Professor at University of Strathclyde, and Lloyd Austin, the Convener of Scottish Environment Links Governance Group and a Board Member of the European Environmental Bureau. So good morning to you all, and thank you very much for coming this morning and for your written submissions, which have been very helpful as well. I'd like to go, first of all, just open up the discussion by going round each member of the panel to just get your general views on one of the issues that has really concerned this committee and other committees over the past wee while, and that is to what extent the trade and cooperation agreement between the EU and the UK potentially impacts on the ability of the Scottish Government to exercise their devolved competence in environmental policy. So can I come to Professor Reid first?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I think that because of the way the trade and cooperation agreement is structured, an important thing to realise is that it's a relationship between the UK government and the European Union, and therefore everything really depends on the political relationship between them. Within the agreement, there are non-regression provisions that say that the parties won't reduce their environmental standards below the current levels. But those are limited in that they apply only where trade and investment between the two parties is concerned. So nobody's quite clear exactly what that means. The consequences, again, are unclear because they depend on the political willingness of the two parties to take things on. So within the main provisions, there's nothing to stop Scotland continuing to seek high standards unless these are seen as making a material difference to trade between the whole UK and the European Union, but that is in the hands of the political bodies. So there's lots of uncertainty, there's lots that depends on the political reactions to things rather than what we were used to in the EU structures, where there were legal provisions dealing everything and that the individual companies, individual parties affected could seek remedies themselves.
Dr. Gravey, do you have anything to add in respect of that around the devolved administration?
Yes,
specifically?
I think specifically on this, I think it's really interesting to see that in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, there's clarification of what is understood as binding on the EU side, and that is EU-wide environmental standards. The assumption in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is that you have UK-wide environmental standards, is you have that kind of level that is the same across the UK, and we know it's not necessarily the case already, and we know it won't necessarily be the case going forward. So I think that's where we see that in many ways the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has been kind of blind to devolution and has not taken into account potential for internal divergence. Now, whether that means it will constrain future divergence or not, I'm not yet sure. I think no one really knows exactly what it will do. It's still a very brand new agreement.
Professor Gemmell.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I agree with both Colin and Vivian. I think the issues are largely of uncertainty at this point because, in theory at least, existing strengths and existing differences at the Scottish level could be continued, provided they don't breach any of those overarching concerns. But we don't know, and it sounds like it could be some considerable time before we're actually very clear about that, because we'll probably have to build up case law. How will it be tested? Will the various Partnership Council and other subordinate mechanisms that are proposed, how will they operate and what impact will they have? And the point I was making at a headline level in my submission is at some point we will need to be able to check the data to show whether or not we have evidence of difference and evidence of impacts both positive and negative. And at this point it's almost alarmingly unclear as to where we might end up.
And I'll come to Lloyd Austin as well before I ask some supplementary questions on this. Lloyd.
Thank you, convener, and thank you everyone for the invitation. I think I agree with the three previous speakers fully in terms of the uncertainty and the lack of clarity, and also with Colin's comment that in many regards things are going to be determined politically rather than legally in terms of the implementation of the agreement. But I think there's two things to note. First of all, we have to welcome from the environment's point of view that the agreement is far better than no deal, and that whilst it has uncertainties and lack of clarity, there is reference to and agreement to non-regression. The uncertainties about that non-regression point are about how and if and when it may or may not be enforced. So to some extent, all administrations within the UK are constrained to the extent that they're not supposed to regress beyond current standards. And I think that is welcome, and that is consistent with the Scottish Government's commitment to maintain or exceed EU standards. I think the one point that's worth mentioning is that there's nothing in the agreement that prevents ambition beyond current standards. I think as with membership of the EU, member states were always allowed to do better than the minimum required from membership. And so if the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament were inclined to have greater ambition, I don't think there's anything in this agreement to prevent that. I think if there were to be constraints in terms of applying such ambition, it would be more likely to be an intra-UK issue than a UK-EU issue.
Well, you brought me on nicely to the idea of the level playing field and also implications of the continuity bill as well at the Scotland level, with keeping pace with future EU environmental standards, but also potentially legislation, regulations, mechanisms to take us further to, for example, our climate change, our emissions reductions targets. How compatible is the idea of this level playing field, this intra-UK relationship, with any kind of progressive policies that might want to go further in Scotland, or indeed any of the devolved nations, when there is an expectation that things have to be consistent and a level playing field across the UK. So since Lloyd, you first brought it up, can I get your thoughts on that?
I think it's one of those questions that's difficult to answer until it's tried, or until we know further about how the UK government and others will seek to implement things like the Internal Market Bill. I mean, we raised concerns about the lack of environmental caveats to the market access principles, for instance, which haven't been incorporated into that act. And as yet, we don't know how that applies. But I would say that, in the 20 years of devolution and previous to that, the Scottish Government and previously the Scottish Office did have considerably different environmental laws and policies within Scotland, and that was never seen to be a problem within the UK internal market. And I'm not sure, unless it affects general UK EU trades, that the Commission would worry too much about differences between different jurisdictions within the UK. They're familiar with different jurisdictions within member states. Länder in Germany operate different laws within the member state. That they would only be concerned if it fell below the level of the European requirements. They're never concerned if things go ahead of European requirements.
Yeah, that's useful. Looking at the other panelists, does anyone else want to come in on that particular aspect?
If I can say something, this is really identifying what's been a long-standing issue with the devolution agreement, that because the UK was part of the European Union and that dealt with so many of the internal market issues, it dealt with the relations between the UK and many international agreements. Divergence could happen between the different parts of the UK, but they could happen within certain constraints. There was an envelope of EU law which limited the divergence, and because of that, this issue was never properly addressed when the devolution settlement was created in the first place. Now we're in the position where we have to face up to the potential for much greater divergence, and how is that then controlled internally? There's always been an issue that it's the United Kingdom that is responsible internationally for everything that happens within the UK, but the UK government doesn't directly control everything that may be relevant. And as I said, so long as we were in the EU, that issue was never going to be a big one, because the divergences in important matters would never go too far. Now potentially they could.
Thank you. Dr. Gravey.
Yes, I think just on this point, and to reiterate what Lloyd was saying, in many ways we could be in a complete opposite direction. It's not so much that the EU would take action against the UK if Scotland were to diverge upward. It's that the UK government could trigger as a rebalancing mechanism, just because Scotland is more ambitious and there is a negative impact on trade and investment for Scotland vis-a-vis the EU. So you could have a perhaps quite odd situation where you have the UK government acting for England that had not become more ambitious, but that could still take rebalancing action on behalf of Wales or Scotland.
Yeah. Professor Gemmell.
Yeah, I agree with all of those comments. I think, for example, the agreement on good regulatory practice and the way in which regulatory divergence actually evolves will be very important, because as others have said, there has been permissive divergence at the moment, usually, although I think not always, because there were higher standards being applied in certain locations. But who will determine and how will we trigger those issues of concern? Will it be at purely the UK and EU Commission level, or will there be, as it were, behind the scenes niggles about things that are unsatisfactory, the way in which the emissions directive is actually being operated in an individual jurisdiction or a sub-jurisdiction? Will that trigger an issue? Or again, as I raised in my submission, when we're looking at REACH standards, if we have different chemical guidance being applied for products, and then those products become part of a market deal at some point, including, interestingly, with third parties. For example, if a product goes to China and comes back from China incorporated in another product, who will actually say, hang on a second, that's not fair, that's undercutting the price of this, or that's creating a larger market share in that? Or these regulators at the point of transshipment are not applying the rules in the same way as they might be applied at Grangemouth, or whatever. It's the nuts and bolts of those kind of details that I think will be potentially interesting, and could be being pursued on purely commercial grounds, which could then be highly politicized depending on the lobbying impact of a particular trade body or whatever. So it might sound very detailed and very trivial at one level, but it could become quite significant. And we've certainly seen WTO deals between the EU and the US, for example, and Japan and China and the EU really get stuck on some of those details around product standards and the way in which products were produced. So the ramifications are potentially enormous. I suspect, as usual, there will be totemic cases or there will be particular issues of political concern. But at this point, it's really quite open. All sorts of things could become potentially problematic. And vulnerable industries in Scotland, I think, could well be very concerned. We've seen already the sea fish and seafood sectors. It could go much, much wider in due course, but be perhaps a little more subtle or a little harder to identify.
That seems like a good point to hand over to Mark Ruskell, who has some questions around the governance of this agreement. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Kavina. It sounds like it's a good time to be a lawyer at the moment with this agreement. But yeah, can I ask you then about the governance and supervision arrangements, particularly what kind of mechanisms there are for dispute resolution, and how you might guess that those might be used in the future?
Well, if I can start, perhaps, it's not that great a time to be a lawyer, because so much of this isn't actually about legal rights anymore. It's all about it's more a lobbyist rather than a lawyer who's going to get the advantage of this. The agreement has a variety of dispute settlement mechanisms. In the environmental area, most of these initially are dealt with through negotiation and expert committees, rather than going to the more formal arbitration measures. And the hope is that matters will be discussed informally between the parties. Then there are expert committees who can provide opinions on things, but again, the resolution is still in political hands. But there are options where there are material impacts for the parties to take rebalancing action, that is to take basically retaliatory measures, ideally in the same area, definitely proportionately, but that could spill out into other ways, the way that we see the current way in which the Scottish whisky industry is suffering because of the dispute on other matters between the EU and the USA that's still not been resolved. So I'm afraid it's, as with everything else in the long agreement, it's complicated. There are several different ways it can go, but the hope is it's going to be settled in the political field rather than relying on the more formal mechanisms.
Yeah. And just before I move on to others to answer that within the panel, could also ask you, Colin, about where you see the devolved administration sitting within those bodies, like the Partnership Council, the specialist committees. I mean, is there any clarity as to whether it will be Scottish regulators or administrations or even parliamentarians that might be on any or all of these particular structures?
I've not seen anything at all in the public domain about how these are going to be set up, who's going to be sitting on them, to what extent, if at all, the devolved administrations are going to be reflected in them, or certainly not who's actually going to be there. But I said I'm only relying on what's in the public rather than any inside knowledge.
Okay, could I go around the rest of the panel then, please? Could we start with Dr. Gravy, please?
Yes, so just to support what Colin was saying around the use of expert panels, so we don't know who the experts will be, but we do know that the EU does use these. These are not just there, just to have something that is never used. I mean, we know that, for example, there is currently a dispute with Korea on labour commitments that falls under level playing field in this treaty, but under the kind of sustainable development obligation in the EU-Korea agreement. Now, that gives us some kind of an insight into the type of dispute that can take place. This is with issues with Korea, deregulating in terms of labour protection, and what we had is, informal discussion between parties, and then moving on to asking for, setting up expert panel in 2018, and finally having only the conclusions in January 2021 that found in favour of the EU. Now, this does show that it will take a long time if we do go down the expert panel route.
Okay, thanks. Move on to Professor Gemmell, please.
Yeah, I agree with Viviane there. I think it isn't clear, but I imagine the danger would be not to take these mechanisms seriously, because certainly I did a piece of work with World Bank colleagues on the Moldovan Memorandum of Understanding and Agreement with the EU, which was far away from accession, but was an early indication of standards alignment and so forth between the Moldovan government and the EU. And the Partnership Council that was set up and the technical working groups that were put in place, they moved rather slowly, but they became very, very significant in terms of the final trade agreement and the way in which the agreement was policed. So I think I would simply say that it's very important that Scotland pays close attention and tries to find a way with the UK government of becoming as actively involved as possible. And I think that also extends to the Civil Society Forum, because that might be the area in which broader societal impacts and non-formalised agencies and organs of government actually get the opportunity to raise concerns or to look at standards that might well have a significant impact on society more broadly. So I think it's certainly important that attention is paid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Lloyd.
Yes, thank you. Like as before, I agree with all the comments of the previous three speakers. I would underline that this is very much a sort of political, even with a small p, process rather than legal process. Everything is resolved ultimately by negotiation between the parties, between the UK and the EU. Advised in different ways by panels of experts, by the Civil Society Forum and so forth. But in all cases, there needs to be a political will by one or other of the two main parties, first of all, to seek that advice, to appoint the relevant groups, to take note of what they say and or to take action on the basis of it. So I suspect there'll be lots of things that are subject to lots of discussion, and only those that have kind of political resonance will rise to the top of the pile and see action being taken. And therefore I think it's important that voices for the environment and voices for Scotland speak up as much as they can in that process. And I think one thing that isn't clear is how and when and who appoints the various groups, and how, for instance, the Civil Society Forum is going to be created. I mean, on behalf of the NGO sector, from both Scottish Environment Link and the EEB, I mean, we welcome the concept of a civil society forum and there being a civil society voice in the process. But what we're not clear yet is how that will be formed and what its role will be. I think it would be valuable for all our sakes for people to speak up and seek Scottish voices on all these forums.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Back to you, convener.
Thank you, Mark. And now to questions from Claudia Beamish.
For attending in these deliberations. I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts on priority areas for collaboration with the EU on a positive note, and whether the agreement will assist in EU-UK collaboration, particularly on addressing the climate emergency and including collaboration on COP26 and also on the inextricably linked nature emergency and the vital way forward for the green recovery. So really, I wonder what role is there for the Scottish Government and our Parliament in Scotland in future in strategic areas. I've highlighted two in particular, but there may be others that relate to our brief that you'd like to highlight as well. And could I, in this instance, go to Lloyd first, please?
Yes, thank you. In terms of collaboration, I think there has to be two forms of collaboration, I think formal and informal. I think formal collaboration, as Colin made clear earlier on, has to be on a UK-EU basis because that's the sort of legal nature of the agreement. But and I think the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament should try and work with the UK government to get as much involvement in that formal collaboration as possible. But I don't think that prevents informal collaboration in addition, and not instead, but in addition. And first of all, I think it's important that Scottish society maintains collaboration with their European networks. And I hope Scottish Environment Link is doing that through our continued membership of the EEB, which is an organisation wider than the EU. Lots of NGOs across non-EU countries in Europe are participate, and we deal with global matters as well as EU matters. And I think it would be positive if other sectors took a similar approach, either whether that be intergovernmental or interparliamentary, as much informal collaboration and networking as possible to learn and so forth is valuable. In terms of the priority areas in the environment, I think I would point to two or three. First of all, I think the EU is in advance of COP15, which is the biodiversity COP in China in May, has launched its new biodiversity strategy, and the Scottish Government is committed to refreshing its biodiversity strategy in this year, along with the COP process. And I think some collaboration on that would be very important. The EU is now committed to legally binding nature recovery targets and a trans-European nature network, which are both things that the Scottish Government could pick up on for Scotland. I think collaboration about the Green Deal would be valuable, and looking at how that affects different sectors of the economy, in particular agriculture. And I think inevitably, given our marine boundaries, collaboration with the EU and other non-EU states in the marine environment and over fisheries would be an important issue. We have a number of important marine protected areas, for instance, that abut onto neighbouring states' marine areas. So collaboration and cooperation over the management of those would be important.
Right, thank you. Could I just ask you to say a little more about the marine issue in terms of where you would see the best informal arrangements for trying to protect our environment and provide appropriate mechanisms for the future of our coastal communities as well?
Well, first of all, I think the marine environment is a classic example of where the environment doesn't respect political boundaries, with currents and fish shoals and other things crossing boundaries all over the place. I think there has to be, again, two kinds of cooperation. There has to be the formal cooperation, which can lead to agreed legally binding arrangements. But I think that they work better if there's also informal cooperation and collaboration and networking, so people know each other and know each other's interests and concerns, and learn from good practice from each country, and so forth. I think the more cooperation like that, the better. I think in particular in relation to management of fish stocks or the management of transboundary MPAs, agreeing objectives and agreeing to apply appropriate joint measures is important, but for any of those to have effect, they have to be done through the formal measures because of the need for them to apply in law. But they work better if there's parallel informal cooperation. How the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government's legal responsibilities equate with the UK's role in international negotiations comes back to the question that Colin talked about earlier about the inherent issues of the devolution settlement.
Thank you. And could I come to Vivian next, please?
Thank you very much. I think on this question, I find as though having compared quickly the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with other EU trade agreements, I think the possibilities for regulatory cooperation and for working together in international fora on the environment are wider. I mean, they're more developed. And so I think there's definitely appetite, and we can see, at least on climate issues, there's clear commitments to having well-functioning carbon trading for 1st of January, but also climate neutrality. That's clearly stated. I think there's a question whether that motivation on climate also is present for other environmental issues. And there, I think definitely COP26 in Glasgow will be a key test, but that in a way is a test of where both parties have said they want to have a very impressive deal, and they want to keep on working together. I think what Lloyd was saying around COP15 might be a better test, because we have not seen, at least for now, such level of commitment to biodiversity, at least on the UK government level, than we've seen on climate.
Thank you very much. And could I come to who'd like to go next? Next. Colin, or should we come to Colin next and then to Campbell? Thanks.
Yes, I think it's good that the agreement has within it all sorts of commitments to working towards climate change, sustainability, and those things, but they're general commitments setting out wide aims rather than actual concrete obligations to do things. You obviously have in the fish area, you've got very detailed provisions trying to set out a framework with certain goals for the policy that the fishing objectives are going to be followed and so on. But it all comes back again to this political will that it's better that they are saying these things in the agreement than not. It allows people to lobby, it allows those in government to pursue these issues, to say we should be doing this and so on. But in terms of actually requiring things to happen, as with most international agreements, it's remarkably weak. There's remarkably little there.
Thank you. And to Campbell.
Thank you. Yeah, I again agree with all of the above. I think I would probably highlight, as Vivian was sort of starting to do there, excuse me, the issue of regulatory cooperation, because we have developed such a lot over the last 25 years in terms of the relationships between the various bodies across the EU. And Scotland has played a disproportionately strong role, certainly in the brown environment, but I think more generally. that really has been very valuable mutually, and I know that there are a lot of people within the Commission, the EEA and other relevant institutions who are keen to continue to have that input, because we have tended to take an engineering-led technical approach to a number of these issues, and I would certainly hope that that would be a continuing priority. I also think around Euratom, as we continue to decommission the major units within Scotland, access to that expertise is valuable now and will continue to be valuable. And the loss of some of the oversight and peer review opportunities was a risk. But I think it's relatively safe at this point, in addition to the IAEA involvement. But I would certainly hope that that would continue to be a priority. And there have been times where the UK government has taken a rather less focused view there than was the case in Scotland. And I think we would want to be sure, I would certainly urge that cooperation was seen as a priority going forward. I also think that the way in which JRC works at the EU level is something that Scotland would want to continue to be aware of, because that technical advice underpins so many different areas of regulation, not just in the European market, but within the UK context at the moment. And by not seconding people, by not maintaining networks, etc., there would be a real danger that that influence, that impact, and that focus might be lost over time. So these are areas where I would certainly see it as being really important. And finally, I imagine that you can take evidence and already have had a very good set of inputs from the UK Climate Change Committee, but I would be very interested in their views about how to make sure that both on the trading agenda and the way in which emissions forward planning targets are worked out, because like water, air is not a respecter of international boundaries or even internal boundaries, we need to make sure that that is given a real priority as well.
Thank you for those helpful answers to all of you, and they've given us a lot to think about in terms of what we might do in terms of connecting with and making suggestions to both our Scottish Government and Parliament. So thank you, and I'll hand back to the convener.
Yeah, I see that Dr. Bravey wants to come back in.
Yeah, just thinking back, I think in terms of areas of cooperation, I think one of the obvious ones as well would be any piece of EU environmental legislation that falls under the Northern Ireland Protocol, because as Northern Ireland will have to keep pace anyway, then I think there may be more interest, like it would be very good to have regulatory cooperation on these areas to also perhaps enable the rest of the UK to keep pace more easily and thus not like widen the gap between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. The other areas, I think, just jumping on what Lloyd was saying around the difference between informal and formal ways of cooperation. I think you also have other formal ways of cooperation. And here I'm thinking of, again, the Good Friday Agreement and the British-Irish Council, and the fact that, for example, the Irish government has pledged to develop much stronger links with the devolved governments. So I think it's important when we think about going forward policy development to have also ways in which to have Scottish views heard in Brussels, and there's definitely appetite on the Irish side to facilitate this.
And I'm going to bring in Professor Gemmell again.
Thank you very much. I just remembered that we haven't really touched on the UK Environment Bill, and I think it will be really important to try and find those informal, in particular, I suspect, opportunities to influence, because if the UK government alone, without DA input, determines that which is a priority for collaborative effort, etc., then we risk, not having a number of Scottish issues taken seriously. And I do hope that eventually, when there is a UK Environment Bill visible in its full detail, not only will the final arrangements for OEP become clear, but we'll get a stronger sense of some of the priorities that do exist there. And I mean, to give credit where credit's due, some of the work that has been done on air pollution control in England has been extremely productive, and the CAF's work in Scotland to some extent went on the coattails of that. But I'm hoping that air continued air quality management and pollution reduction will be a priority at the UK/England level. But I think we'll get a further opportunity, both I hope to influence, but certainly to see what the UK government considers the priorities to be, which will then allow a clearer view as to what we are going to be able to align with in Scotland, but equally where we may have to put further informal effort in order to get the important issues tackled. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lloyd Austin would like to come back in.
Thank you, Covina. Vivian's last comments about Northern Ireland and the British Irish Council reminded me of, in a sense, other international arrangements that provide other opportunities for what you might call cooperation within formal structures, which are not EU, but in which the EU take an active part, and therefore participation would enable collaboration with EU partners. I'm thinking in particular not only of the UN processes, the COP for climate and for biodiversity, but equally UN regional processes like the Aarhus Convention and the work that does in terms of access to justice in environmental matters, which is, I know, an issue of concern to some members of the committee, and will actually be subject to the future consultation on environmental governance under the Continuity Act. So, you know, engagement in the UN ECE would be a good way of keeping up good relationships on those matters. And of course, there's also the Council of Europe, which is another body, and I know the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Congress. I'm not sure whether that includes people from the Scottish Parliament or not, but there are certainly ways in which folk from Scotland should be able to be engaged in those processes and therefore keep tabs on European developments.
Thank you. Mark, you wanted to come in with a supplementary question on this area. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about whether there are particular markets where enhanced collaboration could deliver benefits for the environment. So I was thinking partly about the European Union's strong target to increase organic food and farming, whether that's an area for collaboration, whether, you know, solar panels, embedded renewables might be an area where collaboration over standards and market could be a way forward that might be beneficial.
Who would you like to direct that at? Anyone in particular, Mark? Does anyone want to answer that?
I don't know if anybody wants to chip in on that.
Dr. Gravy.
I think this would be definitely, I think in many ways, because it's the UK and the EU that are that can initiate regulatory cooperation, not Scotland. It's all about selling to the UK government as well areas of where regulatory cooperation should be pursued, and linking. And we've got an agreement, of course, where there's lots of commitments around trying to further the trade and sustainable development together. So these areas that you are pointing out could definitely be something that there may be appetite for in London. So while there may not be necessarily the only areas where regulatory cooperation should be pursued, there may be the easier one to start with, at least.
Thank you. We're going to move on to questions around replacement for EU funding from Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, convener, and good morning to the panel. Yes, with regard to replacement of EU funds, we know that as a non-EU member state, the UK is no longer entitled to automatically participate in EU funding programmes, including CAP, life funding or structural funds. However, the agreement makes provision for UK participation in Horizon Europe for the 2021 to 2027 period, which is, as we know, the £100 billion research programme. And just as an aside, when the committee visited Brussels some time ago now, We met with the Norwegian delegation or directorate, and they told us that they participated fully in what was the Horizon 2020 scheme. Of course, Norway has a closer tie with the EU now than we have. But can I ask the panel what they feel are the implications of the agreement for the formulation of replacement funding programmes, including any rules on subsidies or state aid, which will clearly be an issue? And could I go to Professor Gemmell first, please?
Thank you very much. I think it's a good question. I'm not at all convinced I know the answer, so apologies for that. But I think the loss of structural funds across the set is clearly a major issue, and Scotland has benefited very substantially over the years. I think the Horizon component is potentially significant, and obviously we're talking about Erasmus workarounds and various other things that are being considered. So there are ways forward, but I do not see. I mean, LIFE has been very creatively and constructively used over the years, and the loss of LIFE alone, I think, is a major blow. I cannot think of very simple paths towards substitution, as it were. I think the funding simply doesn't exist, and as you said, the Norwegian relationship is based on the larger EEA access opportunities that they have that we don't. So I can't offer a constructive response to your question. I think it's a good one, and there is a problem there, but I can't go further.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else wish to comment? Lloyd Austin, convener.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to be a slightly similar answer to Campbell's in the fact that I'll comment that it's a good question, it's a big issue. I'd reiterate the importance of LIFE, which has enabled environmental NGOs in Scotland in partnership often with the SNH or the Forestry Scotland and other public agencies to deliver quite a lot of significant biodiversity conservation work on the ground in Scotland. I think in the 10 years running up to when we left the EU, something like 25% or so of LIFE funds that came to the EU came to Scotland, so we were disproportionately successful in winning money from that. So all I could do is reiterate the importance of trying to replace that kind of funding. Now that has to be, I think, a challenge that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government put to the UK Government and seek to work out a solution. Whether there is a way of creating a kind of Norwegian relationship, I don't know. In terms of subsidies and state aid, I think you highlighted the CAP funding, and I would reiterate the view of environmental NGOs that reforming agriculture policy remains a very important agenda item for the future. And I think one thing that is clear in terms of how agriculture subsidies and international trade interact is that the more you direct those subsidies into delivering public goods, whether that be environmental or landscape or access to the countryside, or even issues like the maintenance of populations in remote areas, an interest of Angus's. I think those kind of public goods forms of subsidies, where public money is going to deliver public goods rather than price and market distortions, tend to have less impact on trade deals, and that possibly is, in the long term, the way to go for subsidising farming and crofting.
Okay, thanks. And following on from Lloyd's response there, can I ask what the panel believe are the priorities for the development of replacement funding schemes? If anyone would like to expand on that.
Angus, Professor Reid would like to come in.
Okay.
Thank you. It's not so much on the replacement funds, because that's very much now a domestic matter between the UK, Scottish Government, how they're going to develop their policy. I was just going to make the point that in relation to subsidies, there are actually significant provisions in the agreement about subsidies, particularly setting down principles on which they can be granted, which allow for environmental support and so on, but also structural, formal issues in terms of having a body, greater transparency for subsidies, having a body that supervises it, having access to the courts and so on. So I think that at the UK and Scottish Government levels, there's going to be quite a lot of thinking about how they actually channel how the processes by which subsidies are provided, because if things fall within the terms of the agreement, then they're going to fall within this much more formal procedural framework than we've been used to.
Okay, thank you. I know Professor Gemmell's further comment in the chat box, which is helpful. If there's no one else, convener, I'm happy to move on.
Okay, I'll just check that there's nobody else wants to come in this issue. No, right, we'll move on to questions from Liz Smith.
These questions are largely about the environmental governance challenge. Obviously, the agreement provides that in relation to environmental law, each party has to ensure that the domestic enforcement agencies give due consideration to any violations in that law. So I just wondered what you consider to be the ongoing priorities for the further development of environmental governance in Scotland in relation to that. I don't mind who answers.
Okay, we'll just go around people. We'll go to Vivian Gravey.
I'm sorry, I didn't fully hear the question. So
it was just what do you consider in relation to environmental governance, where it's quite clear that obviously both parties have to pay due regard to any violations and the mechanisms for dealing with that. But in relation to the new setup, what do you see as the priorities for ensuring that environmental governance in Scotland is as good as it should be?
In general, environmental governance across the UK has had multiple issues with compliance with the Aarhus Convention and with making access to justice easy and not too prohibitively costly. This is something that is repeated again in this trade and cooperation agreement. But I think, trying to make sure that organizations can have a similar ease of access as they had with the Commission, something that is free to raise complaints, is the biggest, I think. Just like that issue of costs for organization would be for me that.
Do you think that would? Do you think there is any benefit to having in beefed up environmental court system? Obviously, in the continuity bill, the Scottish Government gave an agreement to ensure that it would have to review this issue. What's your view on environmental courts, which obviously
as a non-lawyer that also is not very familiar with the Scottish system, I would prefer, I will leave my Scottish colleagues to respond to that one.
Can I ask Lloyd? I think, Lloyd, you raised this issue when we were looking at amendments to the continuity bill. I'd be just interested to know what you feel in terms of tightening up environmental governance.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Scottish Environment Link was very pleased with the committee's support for the amendment that came forward in the continuity bill to ensure that there was a look again at governance in a couple of years' time once ESS is bedded in and develop its strategy and so on. And I think that's probably the first part of any answer to this question, is that we'll need to see how ESS in relation to devolved matters and the OEP, of course, in relation to reserve matters, how they bed in, how they do in terms of the responsibilities they've got, and see how that actually operates in practice. So, one question I would have is, to what extent will we see those two bodies looking at the questions of non-regression and alignment and so forth that we've been talking about under this agreement, and whether they will be making recommendations to the UK and Scottish governments about environmental policies and law in relation to this agreement. ESS does have a duty to keep under review international commitments related to the environment, so it will be interesting to see how it does it and what it advises Scottish Government to do in relation to what it observes, and whether the Scottish Government acts on that advice or not. So I think those are all questions that the review under the Continuity Act should ask, and if necessary, it can beef up or provide additional powers or responsibilities to ESS. I think. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, do you think that in relation to what has happened in England recently, where there definitely have been some issues, do you think that there are sufficient channels whereby there will be good cooperation between environmental standards in the rest of the UK and in Scotland, or are there other ways that we could improve that mechanism for collaboration?
I think it's probably too early to say. To start with, we've got an unfortunate delay in the England-UK situation, with a delay to the Environment Bill and therefore the establishment of the OEP, and that's something we think is a disappointment. But equally, it's an opportunity, perhaps, to seek to improve even more the Environment Bill as it goes through the final stages at Westminster, and cooperation with ESS and other devolved bodies might be something that we would be seeking to improve in that Environment Bill. I think as a second part of the question, I'd quite like to return to the point that Vivian didn't answer regarding Aarhus and environmental courts, which, as you say, it is part of the consultation under the Continuity Act. And I think I would agree that all jurisdictions within the UK have frequently been found by the Aarhus Compliance Committee not to be in full compliance. And it's not only costs, which is an issue, but also the consideration of merits. And I think compliance with the various environmental justice requirements, both the letter of those conventions, but equally the spirit of those conventions, is something that we should look at seriously, because I think we do have a serious issue in Scotland in terms of the rights of individuals, of communities, of NGOs to hold government and agencies to account for their decisions in environmental matters. And I think an environmental court, if you look at where they operate in other jurisdictions, is an excellent vehicle to kind of create the right spirit and enable all parties to have a say at a cost that's affordable, and often it doesn't necessarily always find in favour of the environment. I did a study once on the environmental court in Vermont, and it was promoted by the business community in that jurisdiction, because they were looking for greater consistency between counties within the state, and by ensuring judicial oversight of planning and zoning decisions, as they call it there. The business community felt that there was greater consistency and greater speed of decision making, but equally compliance with environmental law. So I think there are great benefits of that approach, and I think all of those issues should be part of the review of environmental governance as a whole that the Continuity Act now requires in probably early 2022.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And can I just finish on one point, because I think as we were debating the continuity bill and since, not least because of the issues that have affected SEPA recently, I think there's a genuine concern out there amongst many communities that when it comes to holding agencies or the Scottish Government or whatever government to account, when it comes to any breaking of the law, then there are issues about whether communities or individuals feel that they have the ability and perhaps the finance to do anything about it. So I'm interested in what you say on that, Lloyd, because I think that's one of the key issues that we have to pursue, so that there is more of a level playing field to anybody who feels there's any injustice.
And Professor Reid wants to come in on this, Liz.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd just like to say that I think the governance review is really important. The last 2 times the Scottish Government has had consultations on an environmental court, they have, to be honest, been absolutely awful. They've put forward models of an environmental court that nobody's really been seriously proposing and have been incredibly narrow on what they're looking at. So it's really important that the governance review looks at everything: administrative systems, administrative appeals, criminal enforcement, other forms of enforcement, the role of a court, what a court would actually do, how it would fit with other bodies. There's a lot that needs to be thought about together, and in the past there's been a real problem that tiny little bits have been looked at in isolation, and that just is no good for anybody. So making sure that the governance review is actually taking a proper broad look across the whole area is really important.
Thank you.
And Professor Gemmell?
Thank you very much. I suppose this is has been almost my career main area, and the reports that I've written on this subject are already available and fairly lengthy. I suppose I would just say that I think we had a gap before. We now have an enormous gap because we do not have either the Commission or the Court of Justice of the European Union. We also have a gap because ESS is likely to be looking at the strategic and systemic level rather than at the individual case level. I'm imagining that the TCA will be fully within the remit of ESS, and therefore they will be able to look at all of the components, including Chapter 8, the environmental info Aarhus bit. But we need a robust court system. We need an investigative individual case level commission type body. We do not have either of those. We need an educated and robust civil society approach overall, and there are small steps like ERCS in that direction that are important and need to be built upon. And then there is a need to reform the existing governance of our bodies, which were inadequate before we left the EU and are now grossly inadequate. The danger of individual entities in government and below government that are marking their own homework is substantial, and without adequate, robust case level interventions to assess and to hold to account, we are not capable of operating a sufficiently robust environmental governance system in Scotland.
A strong message. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move on to questions from Finlay Carson. Finlay.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. I want to look at environmental considerations when it comes to future trade deals. As we know, gives the Scottish to only the implementation and observance of international agreements, but not actually in their negotiation. So I would like to ask the panel. I'll start with Vivian Gravey. How will future trade agreements interact with the cooperation agreement as it stands, and how will the Scottish Parliament's ability mental areas be affected in future trade deals?
I think on this point, there's two different elements in my response. The first one would be there's lots that is far from satisfactory with domestic provision to for involvement of Parliament, even just the Westminster Parliament, in terms of debating the trade agreement. So I would assume that as the UK becomes just negotiate more and more deals, that there will be pressure to have a stronger mechanism to debate the content of trade deals and to ratify them after a fuller debate. The fact that, of course, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was made available to the Westminster Parliament, very shortly before they had to vote on it, was very unsatisfactory. And so I think hopefully over time, but this would require pressure in Westminster, we will see a better process. Now, whether that process will also include devolved administration, we know that this is something that happens in certain areas. We know, for example, we all remember perhaps the Walloon Parliament holding back EU ratification of CETA. So there is possibilities in other political systems for devolved participation in this, but for now, of course, the devolved competence are such that it would be more likely to be informal process when it comes to having a voice at the ratification stage. In many ways, it is important to have that voice, but it's better to have that voice earlier in the process. That's where I think we're back to not only having representation on all the different committees created for this in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but more generally trying to have representation in the different commissions set up by a Department for International Trade. This is, I think, it's not going to happen overnight. It's really a long process about making sure that devolved interests are considered, and it doesn't look like it is something that comes natural for trade officials on the UK side for now.
Okay, Professor Gemmell.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. It's not clear where we will be for future deals. I think Viviane used a very nice line about the zombification of EU law in her submission, and I think one of the challenges we'll face is the way in which we actually keep pace and the way in which the future trade deals will actually incorporate advances in EU environmental legal positions and how that matches with what happens within the UK. I'd also go back to the UK Environment Bill, because I do not think all of the lines on competence have yet been drawn, and how that then influences the way in which trade deals are done in the environmental terms, I think is going to be really, really important. But I don't think I've too much to add. I think we're going to be able to learn a lot from what happens over the next few years, but it will be hard to form judgments too early on in that about what future deals will look like until we see what, if anything, changes about the nature of the dynamics both within the UK and between the UK and the EU.
Thank you. Can I just open up a little bit and go to Lloyd Austin and Professor Reid? Are there any lessons that you can identify right now for the UK government regarding negotiation of future agreements and how they would interact with devolved administrations, particularly through what we've just experienced in the TCA?
Lloyd?
Yeah, Lloyd, if you...
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Finlay. I think I would agree with everything Viviane said about the kind of scrutiny and the issues of involving devolved administrations. I think the way in which these things are done is perhaps because trade negotiations have been an EU matter over the last few years, and certainly since devolution, we've not really had much experience of this, but I think it's something that the UK government and the Scottish government and the other devolved administrations should seek to work out, because I do think greater involvement of all parties in the discussions are important, and I think that's important for the reason I'm just about to say, which is from the environmental NGOs point of view. We think all trade deals should have enforceable non-regression mechanisms, and that they should not just be limited to impacts on trade and investment. It should be a prerequisite of all trade agreements, because I think all countries in the world seem to like to say they've got environmental ambitions, but across the piece, we see trade agreements that enable different countries to try and seek trade advantages and benefits by undermining environmental standards and so on. And I'm not picking on any particular country in that sense. I think many, if not all countries, are guilty of that at times. And I think there is a need to make environmental and trade ambitions much more closely interrelated. And I think given that the environmental responsibilities of the devolved administrations, that therefore means that there needs to be greater involvement of devolved administrations in the negotiation and in the scrutiny of the implementation. How that works, I don't know, but I think that's an example of the need to get more efficient and effective intergovernmental and interparliamentary relations working in the UK.
Right, who would like to come in on Finley's question next? Is it Professor Reid?
Yeah, I'd just say two things really. One is that in relation to negotiation of future agreements, it'll be possible to point to the non-regression provisions in the TCA if it looks as if a deal with somebody else is going to undermine standards. You'll be able to say, well, hold on, you can't do that because you're going to fall foul of the TCA. In terms of the wider issue of lessons to be learned, well, learning lessons does depend on a vaguely willing pupil or one who's actually going to pay notice to the negative consequences if they don't learn. And I don't think that on either count, the last 4 years have been a great example from the UK government of wanting to achieve the best in terms of how you go about negotiating.
And Professor Gemmell?
Just picking up on elements of that, the chlorinated chicken is well known, but it has become almost distortingly totemic. There are lots of examples from some of the technical advisory work that was done over the last decade, for example, around REACH, which was what I was referring to in the chat, where a particular paint, for example, the standards involved in its production and its use were lowered. And it took a technical subgroup that was actually based in the UK to pick up on the fact that the EU was about to agree that with China. Now, again, it seems very detailed, but it means it was allowing a highly polluting plant to be given an EU contract in China to produce a material that we then wouldn't have allowed as a product into the UK. So the kind of forensic scrutiny that may need to be applied to some of these issues is really quite acute and quite serious, and could affect many small manufacturers or dedicated product companies within the Scottish and broader UK context for that matter. So it does require that kind of international collaboration with technical bodies to make sure that those trade deals are not deliberately or inadvertently either offshoring carbon or inshoring material that is potentially damaging.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell wanted to come in with a supplementary question. Finlay, have you exhausted your line of questioning, or do you want to come back in?
No, I think all I can say is many of the questions we've asked this morning, all it does is raise a whole heap of new questions, which seem even more complicated than the original questions. But thank you for that.
Okay, Mark, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get clear in my head. Maybe there isn't an answer to this at this point, but if you've got the TCA, you've got the EU-UK trade deal, and you've got this kind of these mechanisms built in and be working groups and that kind of thing, how does that then match up with the kind of style of trade deal that we may get in the future that's more like TTIP, that has investor-state dispute mechanisms in it with corporate courts? Very, very different kind of infrastructure around dispute, around negotiations, around disputes. Where do you see the power within that? Is the UK-EU trade deal strong enough to pull standards in the European direction, or do you see ways that other trade deals with other types of mechanisms could really, take on what we've got within the EU deal?
I think that perhaps you're looking for a level of coherence which hasn't perhaps been particularly notable in recent years. The fact that the position at present is the Northern Ireland Protocol is a classic example of this. That Northern Ireland is both it's in the customs union and it meets EU standards, but it's also in the UK, and we seem to have been quite happy to agree what are an irreconcilable position between the two, that either has to be in or it's out, and the UK government seem to be wanting to do both. So I think that different agreements often tend to operate in and be dealt with in silos. The different team does it, and whether there's a joined up thinking across even the UK government, far less between the UK government and the devolved administrations. Too often that's just not there, I'm afraid. So I don't hold out any great prospect for some grand, consistent, coherent pattern across all of these. Each deal will be done separately in the hopes that it's not going to rub against other deals too badly. And if it does, well, that's sometime in the future and somebody else will sort it out. And if there's a political will to sort it out, a way will be found.
I'll come to Lloyd Austin on that.
Thanks, Kavina. Colin said much of what I was going to say anyway, so I won't repeat that other than to agree with it. I will say that one thing that the non-regression part of the TCA does have is the ability that if another agreement is causing the UK to lower standards, then it is possible for the EU to say, hang on, you can't do that under this agreement. So that it would be possible for complaints to be made about the second agreement that's resulting in lowering standards. But as we've said before, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how this TCA would be enforced, and it does rely on political will. And if the UK has made an agreement with a third party, the chances are that the EU may be wanting to make an agreement with that third party as well, and therefore may well be in the same boat, if you see what I mean. So I think it does rely on, all of these things will rely on political will and a degree of cohesion. I think the bigger important part is to seek to get as strong and as enforceable environmental ambition in both domestic and international agreements and law as possible. And the more that every country can enable citizens and communities to challenge their governments on environmental performance, the more that governments will take note of that and not seek to undermine their own ambition in trade matters.
Can I come to Dr. Gravey?
Yeah. So on this point, definitely this agreement, as a trade and cooperation agreement, can be seen as preventing some kind of really wide-scale deregulation, and making sure that the UK would not be able to really kind of undercut its policies. Now, the problem is, of course, with agreements with other parties, would an agreement that allows for importing goods from a party that doesn't meet EU standards at all make it displace, make it harder for EU businesses to sell to the UK because they would be replaced by another company, another country. And I think that's where you have potentially the links between the trade, like this agreement and future agreements. But the EU is the closest trading partner to the UK. I think it would take, I mean, a lot of the deals that the UK is going to make will be with very small economies. And so having an impact from one of these trade agreements that is sufficiently large to trigger the large impact on trade and investment that underpins this, the non-regression principle in this treaty, I think is unlikely. But even if it were, I think then we're back to the question I think that Lloyd raised at the beginning, or it might have been Campbell. It was like, how do we actually measure this? Do we know like what data will be used? What are we going to be looking at? And as long as we don't know how we're going to be measuring the impact on the level playing field, it's really hard to answer that question.
And I'll come to Professor Gemmell.
That was largely the point I was hoping to make, that it's a how will we know issue. It could take some considerable time to do that, but I have a feeling that only the most important issues will be given attention because of the way administrations will work, and therefore it will matter hugely where there is a critical divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK, because I imagine that in the agreement and the policing of the agreement, the UK will dominate, and therefore something that is of particular significance to Scotland could well be overridden or just not brought to attention. And the centre of gravity undoubtedly is most likely to lie at the EU end. So whilst there are competing cases, therefore there are competing pressures, there will be a draw for Scotland to maintain that contiguity of standards with the EU level, but at the same time, if there is competitive advantage that the UK seeks in different standards, then Scotland could be at a disadvantage. But we simply won't know for a while, and we may not know for a very long time, depending on the data that we can actually get our hands on.
We are rapidly coming to the end of our session, and we still have questions from Stuart Stevenson, but Angus MacDonald wanted to ask Professor Gemmell about something that they mentioned on REACH. Angus.
Convener, yeah, it's a point that will be put into the regulatory panel next, but given that Campbell Gemmell's raised it, we know that, or raised the issue of REACH, and we know that a deal wasn't agreed to share REACH data held by the ECHA with the UK. And we also know of a joint letter from chemical and other industry associations to the government asking for a radical deregulation of the UK's post-Brexit chemicals regime. And the letter reportedly proposed that the government should deregulate GB REACH. Now, the deregulation would remove the obligation for industry to submit detailed safety data and instead create a weaker and slower system. So it's no wonder that the industry is referring to the new regime as breach. So the industry proposal would mean it would not be a robust regulatory model, as the GB regulator would have insufficient data to properly regulate chemical use. So, I mean, clearly that is a concern to me, at least. Would you agree, Professor Gemmell?
Yes, I do agree, Angus. I think you're absolutely spot on, and I think it's a potentially really serious problem. Not only because of the deregulatory underpinning of it. I mean, it is basically intended to make it easier to produce chemicals and to use chemicals in a more laissez-faire manner, which I never think is a good idea. But B, because the regulatory oversight model is so fractured, i.e. that we're dependent in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, the rest of GB, on the Health and Safety Executive and its involvement in this space, and both at a resources level and in terms of technical leadership and collaboration, that's not necessarily always been terribly effective. So you might get Scottish and other regulators saying, we will rely upon the best possible blah. I'm afraid I remain to be convinced on that front, and I think we need to be maintaining substantially the REACH standards, and in many ways the failure to get a better grip on this at the Scottish level previously by having the HSE's powers actually devolved to Scotland is still an open question, and something that really merits serious attention, even if the arguments against are based on, you know, critical mass of expertise, etc., etc. That didn't win the day in terms of an environmental regulator, so I do not understand why it can't be applied more robustly to health and safety, which after all is rather important.
Thank you.
Dr. Gravy wanted to come in quickly.
Yes, of course, REACH is part of the regulation that Northern Ireland will have to apply, like to keep applying under the Annex 2 of the protocol. And so that means that if we have deregulation of chemicals in GB, that will again further widen the gap between Northern Ireland and GB and would not necessarily be a very good idea.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I don't think I'll delay us terribly long because I simply wanted to ask whether the any further implications of the trade and cooperation agreement with any of the specific common frameworks that we know anything about. It's a subject that's been touched on a continuous basis throughout our discussions, and I thought I might handle it simply by asking Campbell Gemmell if he did get any observations on that, and anyone else who thinks they have. Perhaps put something in the chat box for the cover.
I hope you got that. Stuart's having connection problems today, but I think you got the gist of it. So I'll go to Professor Gemmell first, and if anyone else would like to come in, please put an R in the chat box.
Thank you, Convener. I actually suspect Lloyd's probably a better place to comment on this than I am. I certainly don't see anything relevant or that I can comment on further than what's already been covered, so I won't take up any more time.
Okay, thank you. Lloyd Austin.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks, Campbell, for setting me up. I've got little to add. We as NGOs, and by NGOs I mean not just Scottish Environment Link, but our partners in Greener UK, have maintained a dialogue with both the UK and the Scottish Government and Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Executive about common frameworks. We know that there are a number of common frameworks that now are operating on a provisional basis. We're expecting the sort of formal stakeholder engagement to happen during this year before the provisional frameworks are kind of signed off. One thing I would say is that it does seem to us that the frameworks are to a great extent about process and procedure, about how the officials of the four respective governments are going to work together rather than what they're trying to achieve. And so we have often been advocating for greater clarity as to what is the environmental ambition and what they're trying to achieve to be part of those common frameworks. I think in relation to the cooperation agreement, the TCA, I think one aspect that was not covered to date in the common framework discussion was the issues that we've talked about today in terms of the non-regression and the rebalancing and so forth. And I would hope that the subsequent discussions during this year on those common frameworks before they're finalised might take that into account, so that the kind of issues we've talked about as to whether or not if devolved administrations have a different approach to an environmental issue, how that may or may not be affected by compliance or with the TCA might be a topic that is addressed and dealt with through the common frameworks. But most of the common frameworks reached that provisional position before Christmas, and therefore it was before many people saw the agreement. So I think it's a topic for the stakeholder involvement on the common frameworks during the course of this year. That's probably all I can say, but I think, as we said earlier on, I think many of the issues are more to do with inter-UK relationships than with the agreement as such.
Okay, and finally, I'll come to Professor Reid for the final point on this, and then we'll have to move on to our next panel. Professor Reid.
It was just to say that the provisions in the agreement on good regulatory practices would fit very nicely with a proper common framework agreement, both how they're developed, consultation on them, the way in which the UK is presenting a single regulatory framework to the EU. But again, the experience has been that we really don't know how seriously the good regulatory practice provisions are going to be taken, and how the UK government is seeing it's going to be able to fulfil its obligations when it doesn't actually control the regulatory activity in several areas covered by the agreement.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for your time this morning. It's been very, very helpful. We're going to suspend for 5 minutes to allow a change in panel. We'll be back soon. We continue now with our evidence session on the environmental implications following the UK's exit from the EU. And I'd like to welcome our second panel today. We've got Jim Martin, the Chair of Environmental Standards Scotland, Lisa McGuinness, the Deputy Director of Head of Compliance for Marine Scotland, Robbie Kernahan, the Director of Sustainable Growth for Nature Scotland, and Nature Scot rather, and Terry Ahern, Chief Executive Officer of SEPA. And I have an opening question about your analysis about your relationship with the TCA. First of all, I want to just say that I appreciate that SEPA has had significant operational difficulties in the new year as a result of the security breach on your system. So I want to just caveat that I know that you've had significant problems there. And so if I can go around each body first, just to ask you what analysis you've undertaken or advice that you've received in relation to the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And I'll come to Jim Martin first.
Thank you, Convener. As you might imagine, we are in a very early stage of developing Environmental Standards Scotland, given that Parliament only finished discussing the bill on the 22nd of December, and we only received royal assent, I think, 10 days ago. We're still at very early stages, but we've made very early contact informally with the EU Commission to try to get some understanding from them of their expectations going forward. And I have a meeting scheduled for next week with the chair of OEP. Does the same thing. We are beginning to analyse our obligations under our legislation to keep under review the impact of international agreements on Scottish Government, public bodies and environmental processes in Scotland. I think in 6 months we'll be able to answer your question a bit more fully, Convener, but after about 6 days since the royal assent, it's maybe a bit early for that.
Jim, can I ask you what kind of things you're going to prioritise raising in those meetings?
Yes, in the first instance, it will be about working out how we're going to work together and what we think the implications are of the TCA is one part of that. For example, Article 7.6 of the TCA, there's a commitment for the EU and the UK to cooperate in effective monitoring and enforcement of the law with regard to environment and climate, but also to regular meetings between the EU and relevant supervisory bodies in the UK. And we need to understand, how ESS will fit into that. I regard ESS as a significant supervisory body within the UK. I would expect our organisation to have a role there. So it's that kind of area that we are looking at just now, the practicalities of how we engage. Thereafter, as an organisation, we will have to work out how we're going to monitor these things as we go forward. And that's an early part of our work plan.
Thank you. And I'll come to Lisa McGuinness next. Lisa.
Thank you, Convener. So, we've seen a significant increase in the sort of statutory powers and obligations, as well as the sort of non-statutory roles that we've had done. So we're having to undertake fairly significant analysis around about that at the moment. It's still ongoing, as you can imagine, due to the sort of scale and complexity of it. Because there's over 80 powers in relation to marine policy and around 500 obligations that were previously undertaken by the European Commission or member states, which have now been transferred to us. So we're continuing to sort of evaluate that and understand the implications for the sort of regulatory activities that we need to undertake. So it is still ongoing, that sort of analysis, but hopefully that gives you an idea of the scale and the complexity of what's transferred across.
Thank you. And Robbie Kernahan.
Hi, good morning. I think it's fair to say, we've been preparing for a future outside the EU for several years and inputting into development of a whole host of things. But looking at the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in particular, there haven't really been any immediate impacts for NatureScot on our work. Lots of interesting issues about level playing field and what the agreement does and doesn't say, and still lots of uncertainty about how that act will work in practice, and we've explored some of that this morning with the panel, and look forward to the discussion this morning. But in the immediate term, I think NatureScot has probably gotten off relatively lightly compared to some of our other regulatory colleagues in Scotland, but looking forward to the discussion this morning.
Okay. And to Terry Ahern.
Yeah, so two sources of information. One has been working with Scottish Government officials who've been advising us on the analysis and work they've been doing. The other source is we regulate 34 sectors of the economy, so working with mainly the trade associations to understand what they're seeing as, at this stage, because it's very early, what the likely impacts are. So as an operational agency, that's another source of key information for us to help understand what the future impacts might be. And I should say, Convener, thank you also for your opening comments of acknowledgement that I might have a little bit of trouble answering some of the questions at the moment. So much appreciated.
And in terms of what I imagine you were listening to the panel before. I mean, some of the issues that our experts there have thrown up as potential. Are these things that you recognise? Are these the sort of things that you're hearing as you're engaging in your analysis with your stakeholders and your partners and the other people that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, it may frustrate committee members during the morning, as it's already been said. It's very early days. So some of the things that were talked about in this morning's session, yes, they've been certainly raised as potential impacts or implications, but it's hard to know whether those are going to come to fruition or not. I think the important thing for us is to be working with Scottish Government officials and with the people we regulate and those with an interest such as the environment NGO movement to be prepared if they do become impacts and implications so that we're not caught unawares.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move into the detail of our scrutiny this morning and our analysis. I'm going to go to Finlay Carson, who's got questions around the level playing field and rebalancing provisions. Finlay.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. There's aspects of the agreement which are written evidence that was provided by some of the stakeholders, and you would hear in the previous session, highlights some uncertainty over what levels the regulatory divergence would be regarded as acceptable or unacceptable, and how disputes would be triggered and so on. So can I ask from your perspective, what are the implications of a level playing field and rebalancing provisions for environmental standards the UK, across Scotland and the UK, and whether they are there's constraints which either reduce or enhance environmental standards? Maybe start with Jim Martin.
I was listening very carefully to the previous session in the panel of experts, and it was very useful for me because it began to inform the kind of agenda that we will need to create for what it is we begin to monitor and what we begin to assess as we go forward. The TCA is throwing up a number of issues which perhaps weren't originally in people's minds when they created Environmental Standards Scotland. But we do have an obligation to monitor international obligations. And I think the level playing field provision of that falls within that. So one of the areas I think we will be wanting to look at in the future is the implications of that and the impact of that. I'm sorry I can't be more precise than that at the moment, but I just want to assure the committee that it's something which is definitely on our agenda.
Terry, do you feel that there's anything with regards to the implications of level playing field, whatever, which will constrain environmental standards?
Again, hard to know at this stage. I mean, what I would say is what we do is we take Scottish environmental law, which, as all committee members know, is at this point largely a translation of European law, but we take the standards that exist on the day and we just try and apply them fairly to everybody. I mean, in the first few weeks, we haven't come across any issues, so it's hard to know whether we will or we won't. But I would come back to, a main point we would always make to anyone is we have to be very strong in saying, look, the law is the law, we will apply it. If other things are then raised, then we'll have to deal with them as they come. But again, we haven't had those issues come up. Whether they do come up will be a matter for what happens in the future.
Okay,
sorry, convener. Sorry, I should say that, as was said in the earlier panel, one of the things for us, therefore, is working closely with the other environmental regulators across the UK, because even as standards, if they did diverge, for example, making sure that we understand what we're doing, what they are doing, and if businesses operate across different parts of the UK, etc., that we're aware of that. But I wouldn't back away from, we've got standards here in Scotland, our job is to apply them.
Okay, thanks. Well, on the back of that, I'll open it up to the other panel members. Can I ask what your views on governance and supervision arrangements within the agreement and how devolved interests should be represented? So we're back to the argument that a lot of the discussion was around how devolved nations work with the UK with regards to trade deals, whatever. So how do you think devolved interests should be represented? Maybe start with Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. So just to sort of pick up just a couple of those questions there. So I think the sort of TCA and that sort of the level playing field bring with it both opportunities and challenges. So marine protection, as you can imagine, is by its nature, fairly heavily regulated and complex legislatively. So I think, if there's an area where we can simplify those measures and cut through sort of unnecessary bureaucracy without sort of impacting on those environmental outcomes, we're certainly trying to work across Marine Scotland and with other administrations to make sure that we are sort of supporting that compliance strategy. We're also hopeful that sort of minimising divergence from sort of existing EU standards as well means that we'll be able to kind of, maintain the highest possible regulatory standards, but also minimise those trade barriers that come and sort of support Scottish companies to continue to trade with the EU, because obviously that's a very important market for, Scottish companies, with sort of 77% of our seafood being exported. One of the challenges I think that we do potentially face is that, obviously Scotland won't be able to contribute our expertise to sort of delivery of those EU goals directly, although we will obviously work closely in partnership with the EU and other neighbouring countries as we sort of have done in the past. I think there is something round about that governance that's important. Obviously those new responsibilities going forward will form part of sort of Marine Scotland's core business and sort of incorporate into our sort of normal business planning, and you'll get that engagement, you'll see that reflected in our engagement going forward. But we hopefully, we're expecting to see in the next sort of parliamentary sessions those additional legislative requirements, kind of coming through as Marine Scotland starts to exercise that sort of role formally that was undertaken by the Commission, but that we need to continue to work closely with the other fisheries administrations, obviously across the UK, where it comes to management measures and other things. Obviously it will remain appropriate for UK government to have to legislate on behalf of all 4 fisheries administrations as well going forward, both in terms of fisheries and marine protection. But of course that will be with the sort of the consent obviously of Scottish ministers, and will obviously come for consultation in that. I think we also just want to continue to learn from what we've done in the past, so we'll continue to monitor and sort of learn from other administrations, be that in the EU, Norway, Faroes, in the way that we have done, and to continue to enhance that marine environment. So I think at official level we continue to work in the sort of governance that we've got across the 4 UK administrations and indeed with the EU as well.
Okay, thank you. And Robbie Kernahan, can I have your views on how you think devolved interests should be represented?
Yeah, So again, it's early days, isn't it? A system where the 4 devolved administrations come together to work on an agreed UK position in advance of any discussion with the EU has got to be the preferred approach. Now, how easy that is, I think we shall have to wait and see. And as we heard from the panel this morning, quite a lot of that negotiation, round the table discussion, dispute resolution if need be, that is very much a political rather than a legal arena. I think the challenge for us is to make sure how best to ensure the Scottish voice is heard. Now, whether that's as part of an expert panel or through any of the arbitration processes, I think it's important that we as a regulator in Scotland can work closely, share experience with other devolved administrations and their advisors, which of course we do. And our role is to continue to support Scottish Government colleagues as and when those conversations take place. So, you know, we're already a member of a number of interagency groups which are looking at, in detail at evolving policies across the 4 countries. We need to make sure that is fed into any discussions or supervision arrangements within the agreement. But there's still quite a lot of uncertainty as to exactly how that will and should work.
Thank you. Terry, would you like to come in on that, please?
Yeah, so when I arrived in Scotland, one thing I was impressed about was the relationship that SEPA has with our sponsor in Scottish Government. So the natural approach is for us, they involve us in these sort of policy discussions, and if they're UK-wide, then they work with UK counterparts. So that will work as it will normally work, and how well that will work will be determined by time. Similarly, with the Marine Scotland position, we work very closely with European counterparts. So the CEOs of all the European Environment Agencies meet twice a year, and I co-chair the Better Regulation Working Group with the Irish EPA CEO. So we do have, and that's just one example of our European connections, which are very strong. There's a long tradition of that at SEPA, as there are in many other Scottish agencies. So those 2 key mechanisms will be the way that we'll continue to work. And I think in particular, the relationships that we have at various levels across Europe, we've prioritised over the past couple of years. I mean, we always did make them and keep them very strong, but with the departure from the EU, we've made them an even higher priority, because we need to have that connection to keep sharing best practice, learning about where things are going, and that will put us in a better position to have the input within Scotland and the UK in those processes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted, one last question, convener. Sorry, my connection's in and out. Can I ask, Terry? You touched on it there about the relationships you continue to have, but do you see the regulators, the role that you play, having a more formal or informal monitoring role and looking at developments in EU law in the future?
Well, they're pretty strong now. So again, given the relationship we have with our sponsor in Scottish Government, there's relationships they will have, for example, with people in Brussels. We have them with our counterparts in the other agencies. So when you bring those 2 things together, I do think they give Scotland quite a strong position. How formalised those become is, again, a position for the future. I think the key thing is we will maintain those relationships through the mechanisms we're in, and we'll use them for best effect as the new system unfolds and works itself out.
Right, we're going to move on to questions from Mark Ruskell now. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Can I ask you then about what has really changed for you as regulators since the 1st of January, and what the implications have been? Perhaps could I start with Lisa McGuinness, because I know that you've had, let's say, a few challenges with shellfish exports.
Yes, thank you very much. So yeah, there's been a fairly significant amount of work having to take place, obviously in the run up to the TCA being agreed, but also in the period from the 1st of January. So there's been a lot of work on deficiency fixing, to sort of transpose the EU law into domestic legislation. That's been an absolutely mammoth task. sort of across a number of policy and operational areas. As I mentioned earlier, there's this sort of 86 powers that we need to assess and work through, but we're hoping not to have to rely on them in the longer term. I think there's something in the region of 500 obligations that have also been transferred from the Commission or Member States across as well. So again, these range in complexity, and while we might be already undertaking some of them, such as licensing and other things, others will be sort of substantially new to the way that we do things. I think we have had sort of significant implications for resourcing our teams, and you sort of picked up on the issues that there's been around about trade, for example. Obviously, we're the starting point of that supply chain. So we have had significant sort of impacts on our operational teams. We've had to kind of really fill an education and supporting guidance gap. So we've had to very much be helping people understand the changes to processes, to the conditions that are now in place to allow them to be able to sort of, for EU vessels to operate in Scottish waters, for example, for our vessels to be operating in EU waters, what it means to be exporting products from Scotland to the EU, be that via Northern Ireland or elsewhere. There's a significant amount of work needing to be done to licence EU vessels to be able to work in Scottish waters that needed to be done at pace, and also verification of UK vessels operating in EU waters, which had to be done for the first time. That obviously brings with it some benefits. There is a level playing field there now. We're all working to the same conditions on licences. But again, it's been very new for those vessels that are operating. We've also seen increased need for controls and administration in respect of things like port state control. So that's sort of seen a significant impact on the sort of workload of our fisheries monitoring centre, who handles all of that, and the time taken to sort of deal with and provide those authorisations. We've also seen significant levels of rework needing to be done on applications that have to be made. So, that has involved a lot of kind of toing and froing. And as you sort of rightly kind of highlighted, the impacts on our business from sort of seafood trade and the impact of the TCA on our ability to trade quickly and easily has meant that we have had to kind of redeploy staff to support in that area. We've also had to support the administration of the Seafood Resilience Fund as well, to try and support those businesses that have been affected over the early periods. So I think, like everything, I think the main bit has really been about that sort of support and education, and of us really trying to get our head around what it means for us as that authoriser, and what are the knock-on effects to sort of those other aspects of the work that we do. I think in Marine Scotland we've got the benefit of being core Scottish Government and sort of close to some of those other groups and other things that are happening, and having sort of the policy and scientists sitting there alongside my side of the house as the regulating body. But significant increases in workloads and just really understanding what's going on. And it's still very, very early days and all of that as well.
Yeah. And what do you anticipate being the resource requirements for that? I mean, is it about redeploying existing staff at the moment, or is it about a future look where you think there's going to be significant resource implications going forward?
So I think there's a mixture. So we put, there was a lot, as has been mentioned previously, there was a lot of planning and work done in advance of that to try and put us into a strong position. So we did bring in additional resources. We tried to increase the capacity and capability of the assets that we've got available to help us sort of monitor and protect the marine environment in the run up to it. We've managed to bring in some additional staff, both on a temporary and more permanent basis. But again, we recognise that we're going to need that at least in the short term while things hopefully smooth out and while we all get to grips with it. But I think until we've managed to work our way through all those additional obligations and what that now means in this brave new world that we're in. I don't think we can really put a finger on what those resource implications are going to be longer term, but we continue to kind of monitor and sort of flex resources in the best way possible to the priorities that we see.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so in terms of SEPA, obviously you've had considerable difficulties, Terry, but more generally with the cyber attack. But can you point to how you've managed to implement changes that have come as a result of the agreement coming into place?
The most obvious one is the emissions trading scheme, which is referred to the UK and we administer for Scotland. So we've got that in place before Christmas. There will be applications that will be in which we're unable to access at the moment because of the cyber attack, but we'll find ways to deal with that. A couple of other things. I mean, the chemicals regulation was talked about in the last session, and again, we're working with Scottish Government to understand the impacts there. We haven't seen any significant change, we don't think, in terms of the transfer of waste, including the Northern Ireland issue, which once more we're working with SG officials and DEFRA on. So in terms of environmental law, that legislative change in terms of ETS, we think we're managing. The other couple of key issues there, no significant impact so far. The other thing, so that's environmental law. The other thing from the trade is, in the early days, there's a little, this is where we need to keep close contact with the industries who regulate. So some are having some challenges in the early days as they adjust to the new arrangements, and that might affect waste disposal or stocking rates, etc. But again, nothing significant we've seen. What's important for us is to keep in close contact with them as those new trading arrangements are ironed out, so that we can adjust. But in terms of environmental implications, environmental law, they're the key ones I outlined at the start of the answer.
Yeah, and in terms of REACH, then, I mean, there does seem to be some concerns there coming from environmental NGOs, stakeholders, but also from industry as well. Has this come up in discussions you've had with industry, having concerning calls from industry for deregulation? There seems to be an issue now about access to databases, calls for potentially a Swiss model to be brought in where there's access to European data, that decisions can be made with some degree of independence. I don't want to draw you on what are political questions here, but as a regulator, do you have concerns about the way that REACH is or is not bedding in at the moment?
Well, the key thing is, sorry, Mark. The key thing is the practicalities of the system. So, I mean, we've got a good long-term working relationship with that industry and its trade association, the Chemicals Industry Association. So they've made statements which, as you say, are for others, their views about how the system should work are for parliaments to work out. Our focus is on the practicalities, as you would imagine. And so far, I mean, again, it's early days. I'm sorry to keep saying all that, but I have to tell you what we're actually experiencing. And in the early days, we're finding things manageable. The key issue that is coming up is the practicality of the system. So the industry will talk a lot about cost and complexity. I mean, again, that's, from our point of view, that's not something for us to judge. That if that's in relation to trade, well, that's for industry to work with governments and parliaments about those arrangements. Our focus on the practicalities, how they influence the environmental outcomes. At the moment, we think that's working out okay. Once more, again, apologies if I sound like a broken record, but that will be worked out as we go through. And our focus will be, I suppose, to assure you in terms of our input to that, our focus will be on what are the environmental outcomes. So people can put forward different views of how environmental outcomes can be delivered in a regime. We do always take approach where the law sets outcomes. What are the most practical ways that they can be delivered, and that those with an interest, us as a regulator, and then those judging us as a regulator and businesses as those who need to comply, are they transparent and clear for people? So that will be our focus in those debates as they take place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in the last session, Professor Gemmell was underlining that point again about the need for monitoring and compliance and understanding the environmental data that's there. Can I ask about how you're going to pursue that compliance issue with the EU and other countries in terms of understanding what the impacts may be?
So, I mean, we had a program already under One Planet Prosperity about how do we move to the next phase of compliance, assurance, verification, monitoring. There are, even at the very simple level of technological developments, there's a lot of opportunities we can take, and we've been exploring things like eDNA testing. So there are ways, good law will, in my view as a regulator, what helps when you're administering is that it's very outcome focused and very transparent. They're the two key things. So the focus we will have on is, keep coming back to it, there's an existing set of Scottish law. What's expected by Parliament, the public, NGOs, etc., business itself in terms of level playing field is that we make sure it's clear whether people we regulate are complying. So we'll continue to look at how we improve that, and that would have happened whether the UK had stayed within the EU or outside. And as in the earlier question, we'll continue to work very closely with our European counterparts on best practice, new innovations in compliance and monitoring. And, a clear direction that, at the moment, most of the laws we administer are pretty similar or are the same as a lot of EU laws. So how do we make sure it's not as though we each need to monitor in the same way. What we need to do is have the same level of assurance and effectiveness of monitoring and compliance regimes. And that's why those links with the other EPAs are quite important, because we get together and someone will say, we've done this, and we all learn from it. We'll say, in Scotland, we're trialling this. And often what we'll do is we'll agree that we'll trial something. This is where my co-chairing of the regulation working group is quite helpful, because we can agree to trial things in different jurisdictions. And as I said in the earlier question, that'll stay a very strong component of the way we work.
Yeah. Okay. Robbie, I don't know if you want to come in on this, or Jim. I appreciate it's early days for ESS in terms of your relationship with the regulators, but Robbie and then Jim, if you've got any points to make on these questions.
Yeah, happy to make a quick observation. Again, if just with a regulatory lens, very little has changed since the 1st of January, largely because quite a lot of our work had gone on to pave the way to make sure that European habitats and species were afforded similar levels of protection, and making sure the legislative mechanisms were in place. So the one thing that has changed, I suppose, and there's no significant resource implications of it, are actually by which we actually do monitor or provide information relating to Scotland and the UK's existing special areas of conservation, special protection areas, because they have now been transferred to the Emerald Network database, which was established under the Berne Convention. So we still have an ecological network made up of those special areas of interest, and to the rest of the UK, and we continue to meet our obligations in that regard. So no real change from a regulatory or resourcing point of view as a result of the TCA.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jim, do you want to come in?
Just very briefly, you're right, it is very early days for us, but one of the benefits we have of the TCA coming when it has come is it's enabling us to think through the groundwork for our plans. And these kind of areas are areas that we're very interested in working out, whether they are something which will be up front for Environmental Standards Scotland to consider, and if so, how, and how we can best liaise with both the EU and with regulatory bodies in Scotland to understand their impact. So early days, but I'm glad it's coming at the beginning and not in the middle.
Yeah. Do you think that UK REACH will be on your work plan?
I don't know yet. We're sitting down and thinking about all of these things, and my initial hope is that we will put together an interim strategy sometime in the next few months, which we will consult on. And in that strategy, I hope that we would have the range of activities that we expect Environmental Standards Scotland to be pursuing in its early days, So hopefully by doing that and engaging with people and getting some discussion around it, we'll come to a work plan that allows us to meaningfully prioritise what it is we do with the limited resources that we'll have.
Okay. Thanks, Kavina.
Thank you, Mark. And then we'll come to questions from Claudia Beamish. Claudia.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel, and thank you for the written submissions as well, which were helpful in guiding the framing of this discussion with you. While respecting that the policy context will, of course, be developed in discussion with a whole range of stakeholders and communities by the Scottish Government and Parliament in the next session of the Parliament, I would like to broaden out the discussion slightly and ask if any of you have anything that you'd like to comment on in relation to priority areas for collaboration with the EU, and what are those likely to be in your view in relation to environmental standards, in relation to the climate and nature emergencies, and in that context, how if you've already highlighted this, then just say so, please. But how will the regulatory bodies who are in front of us today collaborate with EU organisations going forward? And will this be impacted by the agreement? So could I perhaps begin with Jim on that, please?
Yeah, we've already begun discussions with the EU, very informally, to try to bottom out how we can get access to information and data on developments in environmental law, and also to learn from them on their monitoring regimes and data collection regimes, so that we can begin to put in place something which may replicate some of the work that the European Commission has done. It maybe goes back to an earlier question. I don't think the TCA is very helpful in that it does not really define the roles of the devolved administrations in some of the detail of the agreements. So that, I think I mentioned earlier at Article 7.6, there is a need for consultation with supervision bodies within the United Kingdom. And I'm keen to understand both what the European Union view of that clause is, but also what the Scottish and UK government's view is, and also the OEP's view is. And I think that that discussion with the EU will help inform our approach to how we intend to be involved in that area of scrutiny. So at these early stages, we're trying to understand the extent to which we can replicate the European Union functions that we need to do, but also to understand both what the UK and EU governments meant by some aspects of the TCA, because they will undoubtedly impinge on our work. And then to do that, I intend to also, as I said, I'm talking to the chair of the OEP next week, but also to liaise with our colleagues in Wales and Northern, get their view, to see if there's a collective view, and to see if there's any way in which we can work together along.
Right, and can I just ask you, Jim, I appreciate that it's early days, and also it's a deeply complex political and legal landscape as we go forward. But what would your priority areas be that, in terms of the areas that you think are likely to come before the body that you are chairing, that you'll need to really focus on? If you could just share some thoughts on that with us, please.
Yeah, our first priority will be to make sure that our setup is properly handled, that we understand fully the extent to which Parliament intended us to act. In other words, we're going to try and work out what you guys meant by the legislation that we passed. So that's not going to be an easy job. So that's number one. We then have to put in place credible monitoring and policy positions that we can follow. We then have to work out how we are going to investigate the complaints that come to us. We're concentrating on these aspects at the moment, rather than trying to anticipate which areas of concern might come to us. I think that would be foolish, because inevitably, if we come up with the top 4 or 5 areas, number 6 will be the one which hits us first and takes most of our resources. So at the moment, I'm afraid, the only answer I can give to you is that we're in the preparation and planning stage. We'll happily come back to the committee in a few months and tell you where we think these areas are.
Right, thank you for that. And could I come to Lisa, please, on marine issues?
Yeah, so it won't surprise you that many of our priorities are very much in that operational space at the moment. So continuing to work through the negotiations, for example, to make sure that we've got sort of better regulation of species, areas of operation, accessibility to the waters round about Scotland, allocation of stocks to sort of enhance that sustainability. So I think that's a priority and an ongoing piece of work just now round about how we're engaging the EU and all of that. I think, as we've heard quite a lot of today, is about that ongoing monitoring capability. So in that sharing of information and data. So, we've been able to kind of seamlessly transition a lot of our data exchanges and the way that we monitor across EU and Scottish and UK waters, for example. We want to see that sort of level of monitoring and sharing of information continue. And then I think the other thing to say is from a kind of compliance strategy point of view, we obviously work very, very closely with all sort of countries, that operate in and around, our marine environment. So I think we want to continue to be able to engage in that way by being able to sort of work together where infringements are found or where illegal activity may be taking place, or where licence conditions haven't been adhered to, for example, and by working with the flag state to take action where appropriate and moving forward. So I think the kind of priority areas for us are at the moment very operational. A lot of the regulatory legislation has just transitioned across quite. It's not easily, but it doesn't change too much just now. But I think as we start to understand a little bit more about what the TCA actually means, I think that'll sort of enhance a lot more about where some of those priority areas of discussion may take place. And we're already touching on things like, marine protected areas, more offshore environments, for example, sort of large vessels operating in and around our waters. We need to kind of start focusing in on these sorts of areas. So yeah, very operational just now, but probably starting to move into that more policy strategic space moving forward.
Thank you. And could I come to Robbie, please?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think as we've kind of touched on already, and keeping pace on biodiversity and climate change, especially this year, is going to be increasingly important. I think in the session this morning, Lloyd referred to the EU launching its biodiversity strategy for 2020 to 2030. And that commits actions on a number of things. So a larger EU-wide network of protected areas, the EU Nature Restoration Plan, introducing measures to enable, I suppose, the necessary transformation. All of those areas, I think we want to work both closely with UK governments, but also EU in helping Scottish Government, I suppose, prepare for Scotland's new biodiversity strategy, which we produced following COP15. So building consensus around the ambitions, both for COP15 and COP26 for tackling climate change, I think is crucial. So those are very obvious, I think, priorities for collaboration for us. Now, how we do that, we will continue to work, I think, with those organisations from EU member states on projects that will further our thinking on halting biodiversity loss. And indeed, there was reference made, I suppose, to some the new Green Deal, work on green infrastructure. There's a number of strands to that, Claudia, where we've got some good connections already, as Terry's alluded to. We'll continue to work with those collaborations and organisations to share experience on specific projects and tackling those big issues that affect nature and landscapes. We want to continue to do that. And indeed, I think both COP15 and COP26 provide a really good opportunity to showcase quite a lot of that work. So we're really excited.
Great, thank you. And could I come to Terry, please?
So obviously lots of things we'll continue to work with Europeans on. I think the one big priority is the challenge of how do you continue to deliver against what I would call the first generation set of directives or policies and the new set. So a lot of the first set, certainly in terms of environment protection regimes, were about what I would call specific and often local pollution issues. The second generation are the system-wide changes, so biodiversity collapse, climate emergency, etc. So if I give a practical example, say wastewater treatment with Scottish Water, so we will look under the Water Framework Directive at a river or a loch, and we'll say the monitoring says that the water quality doesn't match what the parameters are, so we would feed then into the capital program development for Scottish Water and say you should have a new treatment plant or upgrade there, and then they weigh that up against everything else. Well, actually, wastewater treatment plants make it easy for people to waste water. And in the decade in which we need to dematerialise, decarbonise, really radically change how we use the environment, is that the right technology for the future? Now, I wouldn't suggest to the committee that we'll be asking Scottish Water to turn off all the treatment plants tomorrow, because those treatment plants deliver a huge amount in terms of water quality. The innovation we need is, if you take a practical example, I've talked to Scottish Water's senior team about, Perth has said that its ambition is to become the most sustainable small city in Europe. How does Scottish Water, SEPA and others, NGOs and a range of players sit down with Perth and say, how could we develop Perth, redesign Perth, change Perth so it doesn't produce any wastewater? Because then you wouldn't need either a treatment plant at all or anywhere near a biggest treatment plant. What I've been completely clear with Scottish Water about is, in achieving decarbonisation, dematerialisation in the way they work and reducing water use, all major environmental challenges we need to tackle, they won't be doing it at the expense of water quality. So I think the big challenge we need to work on, and working closely with our European colleagues will be critical for this, because they all face the same challenge, is how do you deal with both the first generation of environmental laws and policies and the second generation? And that will require a huge amount of innovation. Innovation works best when you're sharing ideas, testing and trialling things, combining things. And if I could just take the chance too, I've referred a number of times to our relationships with our EPA partners across Europe. I should say also, for the committee's benefit, that the door is very open to us. Like Scotland, certainly my experience, with a very good reputation, and there's been no case of our starting to shut out of processes. In fact, the second committee I co-chair, I was appointed to that not long before Christmas. So I think that's the big challenge that we need to focus on, the bringing together the two generations of environmental laws and not achieving the big things like tackling the climate emergency at the expense of continuing to deliver very local and specific environmental outcomes.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Mark wanted to come in on this. Mark?
Yeah, can I just come back to Robbie's point about biodiversity and working with European partners on that? You mentioned in your submission about the EU farm to fork strategy. Obviously now there's a new CAP in place. It's got targets on organic farming, targets on pesticide reduction. Is that something that you're looking at in terms of alignment with those elements of the new CAP to meet biodiversity objectives?
I think, work is ongoing, I think, Mark, isn't it, to try and develop that future rural policy approach in Scotland, and we are providing input into Scottish Government to help develop those transitional arrangements contained within the agricultural bill. And what we are doing, I suppose, at Nature Scot is continue to lead pilot projects to test some of those innovative approaches to delivering environmental outcomes in farms and crops in Scotland. How we do align with some of those EU strategies, I think, for a fair, healthy and environmentally friendly food system, really important. So again, it comes back to keeping pace, and the challenge actually of managing to keep track of everything that's coming out of the EU and try and best interpret and apply that in a Scottish context. We absolutely want to do that, and hopefully we will do that. And we're beginning to see, I think, some of that emerge, even in the appetite for farmers through some of these farmer-led groups looking to reposition agricultural subsidies and what that will entail, what it will also build in terms of metrics and monitoring. Some really interesting things there. So I think in a roundabout way, my answer to that is absolutely yes. Because again, looking at the farming systems from a climate change lens, we need to be beginning to get our policy thinking much more developed than it currently is, and inject a lot of pace and urgency into some of those pilot projects if we're going to be ready for them in 2024.
Isn't there a danger though that we end up with a gap? I mean, particularly given the reductions in the agri-environment climate change funding this year. I mean, where's the innovation going to come from to continue to stay ahead of the curve and keep aligned with Europe on these issues?
Well, I think that's the challenge for us all in Scottish agriculture and those schemes, to make sure that we actually do get that balance right between the future of agri-environment payments and what that entails. And I think there is actually scope for an awful lot of innovation in Scotland in trying to find that balance between environmental outcomes, sustainable food production, and all that entails. But I don't underestimate the challenge of all of that, Mark. I mean, that's a huge priority for us in terms of rural policy.
Thank you. And can we move on to questions from Stuart Stevenson?
Thank you, convener. And I want to just explore, not at huge length, I suspect, development of common frameworks, and in particular, how the work on that relates to the UK Internal Market Act. I think I might just start with Lisa McInnes, not least because of my own constituency interest in fishing, of course, but I suspect that I've heard more progress being made there. And of course, I've got a broad question: how will we know something is a common framework? Because I don't think many of them have got headings at the framework. Lisa.
Yeah, so I'll try and answer that question. It's probably better answered by my policy colleagues who are a bit closer to this, but I'll try and answer it. So I'll try and answer it in terms of the sort of Fisheries Act, actually, because I think that's probably got quite a good structure to it. So, you know, in the lead up to the Fisheries Act, we sort of participated in the sort of common frameworks processes, you know, very much in good faith. And we're very clear that those arrangements, you know, we do think they're the best way of kind of managing those policy differences and respecting that kind of point of devolution, actually, and the sort of you know, the respect for devolution, you know, where that's sort of currently subject to EU law. And I think, as I sort of touched on, I think the approach up to the Fisheries Act, where we're fully involved in kind of, you know, influencing the direction of the Fisheries Act, what should move across, how that should represent, you know, the needs of Scotland within that, have been very, very well rehearsed. I think, without hopefully getting too much into the politics or anything of it as well, I do think that we have got some concerns at official level about how the Internal Market Act potentially threatens that, you know, the whole framework process. You know, we do feel that sort of frameworks, it relies on that sort of equal negotiation and agreement sort of perspective, and, you know, we really want to be a kind of, you know, an equal voice in that sort of decision-making process. And from what we can kind of understand about the Internal Market Act at the moment, it does look like it gives that sort of ability to sort of impose those regulatory choices on Scotland, and have to accept those sort of standards as set by the UK government, which takes away some of that sort of choice, and you know, the bits that we kind of spoke about earlier on that we want to kind of honour with the EU and others. So I think there is a little bit of work that needs to be done about how we go from where we currently are, you know, and understand exactly how the Internal Market Act will work in that situation. But we will certainly, at an official level, certainly be working with colleagues from across the UK and beyond, and trying to get that sort of equal space for negotiation, making sure that we've got those sort of relevant standards in place for Scotland and indeed the UK where necessary, to make sure that we continue to meet those high standards. And then that as we as regulators can actually sort of enforce and make sure that we are implementing. So yeah, apologies for not being a policy person, but hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I'd like to go to Terry and then Robbie with essentially the same question. I think Lisa's seemed to me to identify a tension between the development of common frameworks and the Internal Market Act. And the first part of my question is, does that resonate with you, Terry, and then with you, Robbie? But also more generally, how's the whole project of common frameworks going? I had previously heard that fishing had been a relatively good example of the development, but I'm now hearing slight warnings that that may be compromised by internal markets. Terry, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a huge amount to add to what Lisa said. The one thing I will add is that, well, in addition to their policy questions, so we'll work through the policy arm of government on the common frameworks. The one thing I'll add is the most effective thing to do is try and shift the debate from less or more regulation and lower or higher standards to outcomes. Because if you think about it, if businesses, for example, want to argue for lighter regulation, I'm comfortable if the outcomes are the same as long as the transparency and the sanctions are the same. So if you're talking about the regulatory burden to achieve an outcome, you should always be looking to have that as low as possible in a way that provides the very high levels of assurance and confidence. So if you define regulation and the common frameworks as being about the outcomes, I'm not saying that's a panacea, but it's a more productive way, I think, to have to frame the discussion. And it's certainly how, in our small contribution to the debate through the policy arms, we would focus on it. So I think that the more the common frameworks are about environmental outcomes, the less danger there is of, lowering or weakening of environmental standards and outcomes. But again, I have to emphasise, as an operational agency, we'll have our input. These are policy decisions that need to be made. But that, rather than just saying that, I'm trying to explain the philosophy and approach we would bring with our contribution.
That's helpful. And perhaps Robbie, and then finally coming to Jim as the new kid in the block. Robbie.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And I think we've touched in previous evidence sessions on this. I mean, there are uncertainties of how this Act will work in practice, the effect on business, if we see environmental standards diverge between the UK nations in the future. NatureScot are not involved in the development of any of the common frameworks directly. Terry said we are obviously happy and will support Scottish Government as and when required. So there's not really much more I can add.
That's fine. Jim, how much of common frameworks come into your purview, and how are you contributing to them, and how do you want to contribute to them? Jim?
The answer to that is I don't know yet. And what I'm doing is I'm listening very carefully to what people are saying. There are areas where we will obviously want to monitor things, but I think I'd rather keep my powder dry just now, if that's okay with you.
Fine by me, Jim.
Thank you, Stuart. Are you happy for me to move on, Stuart?
Yes, indeed.
And now we want to address the replacement of EU funding streams, and questions from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. As we've already heard and discussed with the previous panel, we know that the UK no longer automatically can participate in the CAP life funding or structural funds, although we are thankfully taking part in Horizon Europe for the period 2021 to 2027. Now, we've kind of touched on this already, but I wonder if I could ask the panel members what they believe are the implications of the agreement for the formulation of replacement funding programmes, including any rules on subsidies and state aid. Now, Robbie Kernahan's covered this in a bit of detail already, but I wonder if there's any further comments on subsidies and state aid. So if we could go to Robbie and then Lisa McGuinness.
Thank you, Angus. And I suppose just to reflect a little bit on what we provided by way of written evidence, I think we welcome the participation in the Horizon Europe programme. That provides access to quite significant large research and innovation programmes, which will actually, I think, help with some of the collaboration and innovation opportunities for Scotland across the various missions, whether it's in relation to climate change, adaptation, healthy soils and food, some of the things we've touched on actually, where we probably need to maintain close collaboration with European partners. I think this provides a really good opportunity to do that. It will encourage participation and shared experience from a range of both public and private sectors, so I think that's to be welcomed. I think in terms of other aspects of that, though, we still have a sense of frustration, I suppose, to a certain extent, about the lack of certainty about how some of these other funds from the UK Prosperity Fund actually will be administered and shared. And we have relied very heavily to deliver nature outcomes through green infrastructure, strategic intervention in the past, Natural and Cultural Heritage Fund. So it would be really nice if we were a little bit clearer about how those funds will be administered sooner rather than later. I was interested to follow the discussion also this morning about the relationship between funding and state aid, and I think there is something there about moving forward, and certainly in an agricultural sense, if we're actually going to be funding or investing public money for public goods, and that incentivation or subsidy maybe has less material impact or risk of confusion with state aids. But one aspect which I think is emerging and is still needing to be thought through is this concept of blended finance, where there's an increased market and opportunity for private investment into delivering those public goods, whether that relates to woodland creation or peatland restoration or other aspects of delivering services from nature. The interplay between public and private investment is in its infancy. And that's something which we know is a priority for us to work through if we're going to see the nature-rich future, which we need, because that won't come directly as a result of government funding. It will need lots of private investment. So the marriage between those two things, I think, is something which we in government need to work quite closely with over the next 12 months.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Lisa McGuinness, do you have any comments?
Yeah, thank you. I won't repeat what Robbie just said. I think very much in agreement in that space about how we perhaps need to look differently going forward at investment and how we sort of support industry and sort of that environmental approach going forward. I think just on some of the specifics round about sort of the loss of EU funding, and I think just picking up that point that there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about exactly what that replacement will look like and the levels of what that replacement might look like that's coming from UK government. So, for example, we've been told that fisheries, there will be £14 million coming, split across sort of environment and sort of rural economy budgets. We've got sort of £6 million coming round about sort of data and enforcement requirements, which sort of links back to what we used to get under EMFF, round about control and enforcement. And we've also got some wider support coming in that direction, but again, that was sort of restricted. So there's still a lot of uncertainty. We've also been told, obviously, as Robbie sort of touched on, round about the Shared Prosperity Fund. Again, perhaps links through to some of the comments around about the Internal Market Act and how that's actually going to be provided for and how it's going to be delivered UK-wide. So I think it's still very early days in regards of understanding exactly what that funding looks like, the form it will take and how best we use that. But I think there's certainly something I would certainly endorse what Robbie was saying, right, about how we work together and how we work closely with private sector and others to make sure that we are investing in the best way possible across a range of areas.
Okay, so following on from that uncertainty, what involvement have you as regulators had or expect to have in discussions about replacement funding, and any anticipated role for agencies in dispersing the funding, including in light of recent budget announcements?
So Marine Scotland are in a slightly different situation because we're a core Scottish Government directorate. So our policy colleagues and others and our sort of funding leads have been right at the heart of some of these budget discussions. And obviously, as the sort of operational arm, I've been feeding in where I would be looking for investment or what we're losing out from an EU perspective. So I would say that we have been quite heavily involved from a Scotland's perspective in some of that discussion, and we have been working with colleagues across the UK to try and get a handle on getting a little bit more certainty around about that. But it is such early days that's why it's still not just quite as clear as it perhaps could be.
Okay, and can I ask Terry Ahern if he's been involved in any discussions regarding replacement funding?
So, unlike Marine Scotland and Nature Scotland, we don't have a big tradition of accessing European funds. We have accessed some, but we ran the Life Smart Waste project, which is still completing, for example. So it's not as big an issue for us in terms of direct funding. It is an issue, again, as others have touched on, in relation to things like if organisations that might be that we work with, whether they're inside or outside government, have those funding challenges, and they've got to find new ways. We'll have to work with them on those issues. And once more, we would just work through our Scottish Government sponsor department for those discussions about how replacement funds would work. The other thing I'd say on the broad topic of EU funding is being a bit creative about how we access some of the benefits of it. So the Life Smart Waste project, for example, was Scotland and a few other European nations, and it developed a set of tools in relation to thinking about how to better regulate waste and tackle things like waste crime. Now, if we can't be a partner in that, those lessons can still be shared through the other European fora we're in, as I keep referring to, the CO fora that I'm in from the EPA side. So again, not as big an issue for SEPA as some of the other agencies, but we would look to have input both through the policy process and look for new novel ways to share or gain access to the learnings from the European projects we can no longer participate in directly.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And can we move on to questions from Liz Smith?
Thank you. I think my first question is to Mr. Martin. You were obviously at our committee some months ago where you were starting to set out what you felt the priorities should be for Environmental Standards Scotland, and you've just confirmed this morning that you're listening to people and listening to the debate. If you were to identify the key principles by which you want to operate and see good environmental governance in Scotland, what would they be?
That's independence of government, of your committee, and of all the bodies which are represented in this panel today. That we are an independent body who can look independently and make our own decisions. I think we need to have a credible body, and that means that we have to put in place processes and procedures which have got the confidence of everyone operating in the sector, whether that be the ordinary citizen, the NGO, or the public bodies concerned. Our board will meet next in a couple of days' time to look at the legislation, and from that we'll work out what our priority areas of work will be in order to establish the organisation. I hope that we're going to be open, I hope that we're going to be listening, and I hope we're going to be engaging, and we've already begun that. I think I've had meetings now with 4, 5, 6 organisations that we are starting very early on to say to people, please tell us what you think. We are listening, and that's how we want to go about creating our work programme. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. That's very helpful. And just leading on from that, because I think we probably all agree with the principles you've just identified. When we were debating the continuity bill and since, I think a lot of our constituents have been raising issues about if should an individual or a community group have concerns about the environment and any breach of the law, then obviously the transparency that you talk about and the openness and the approachability are all absolutely key. And I was just wondering what you feel about the prospect of environmental courts in Scotland to back up the process. Is that something that you would welcome, given that the Scottish Government's made a commitment to look at that in the future?
Can I come back to you on that? And the reason I say that is that until we've actually looked at what the scope of this organisation is and where the limits and the opportunities are, I think it's difficult to actually come to an informed view on that. I know that
do you have any ideas about how the process of environmental standards and ensuring that they are adhered to can be as relevant as possible to communities and to individuals who might feel that a big bureaucratic system was not something that they would feel comfortable about approaching? Because there are situations where individuals and communities feel that they want to protest. What do you feel should be the relationship there?
Before I do that, I mean, I can only work with the legislation that you have given me. So that the first priority I have is to put in place the provisions that Parliament has given to Environmental Standards Scotland, and then to make an assessment if there are gaps in that. And if there are gaps, what is the best way to try to fill them? At the moment, what we're trying to do in Environmental Standards Scotland is see if we can, from the beginning, create an accessible process, both in terms of our monitoring, but also our investigation functions, which enables us to receive and listen to concerns. Now, that may mean that we have, for example, to say to some people, the area best to handle this concern you have is with this agency or that agency. It may be that it's an area which my board decides is an area of sufficient importance that we want on our own initiative to follow something. Well, we have not been set up as an environmental ombudsman to take individual complaints in, but that doesn't mean to say that we cannot listen to individual concerns. And that is the problem that Parliament has given to Environmental Standards Scotland, is how to balance that. And I'm really encouraged that you think I've got the answer to the questions that you guys were asking, but not quite yet.
Yeah, but you will have, hopefully, in the not too distant future. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you, Liz. And now to final line of questioning from Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. Very simple question, the same question as asked in the last panel. Looking to the future, the UK will be looking to negotiate more trade deals. Are there any lessons to be learned regarding negotiation agreement of future trade agreements? And what do we need to look at for the implications on devolved administrations based on the TCA? And if we start with Terry.
Just waiting for the mic to come on. I think probably still too early for me to say. I mean, the key thing in any of these discussions is how you get combined outcomes on the table together early. Though I'm not making a point particularly about the lessons from the recent experience, just any good policy making or any good change in institutional or legislative requirements, the earlier you can talk about multiple outcomes and how best to achieve them all, I would say is the better. So I would make that as a broad point, whether you're talking about trade agreements or anything else. So sorry, I don't have anything further to add on the specific recent experience, but that's the broad point I would make as a key lesson in these types of situations.
Okay, thank you. Robbie?
Thank you. A couple of quick observations. I think certainly for me, that interagency engagement is hugely important, both in terms of sharing information and identifying issues that can be flagged up to our respective administrations. We need to make sure we have the relationships with our own government to be able to identify issues at an early stage. But the one thing which, listening to the discussion this morning, got me thinking was, in terms of based on experience with the TCA or any future trade agreements, is that the Scottish Government have recently published their vision for trade that sets out, some of the principles and values for trading relationships we want Scotland to have in the future. And that vision, as I understand it, will be used to influence the approach to UK government takes in developing future trade agreements with other countries. So it has to reflect Scottish Government's aims, for fair work and inclusive growth. But more importantly, from a NatureScot point of view, making that transition to net zero, as well as including a set of indicators which future trade relationships will be based on. And the fact that the planet is singled out as a theme is encouraging for me. Okay, it might be a little bit light on specific references, but it is something I think we can build on. So that wasn't referenced this morning, and that was just published in January of this year. So I think that does provide a useful reference and framework for us to have future discussions about any additional trade deals.
Okay, moving on to Lisa and finally Jim.
Yeah, so I think it was really just building on some of the things that we said earlier on. So we mentioned the Fisheries Act and the common frameworks that sort of helped build the governance round about that. So I think similar approaches to any future deals would be really useful, that we've got that sort of common understanding and common negotiating position and balanced negotiating position to be able to do that. And I think linked to that is round about the need to ensure sort of quality and standards aren't sort of lost just to do a deal by any cost. So it's very much about making sure those environmental standards, those green credentials are there, that we're kind of investing in the right trade deals at the right time. So I think there's something about the governance round about common frameworks and approaches to doing things jointly, but also about not negating sort of standards or quality as part of that as well.
I think the main lesson for the UK government is not to go into trade agreements which come out with lacking in clarity. I think there are areas of this trade agreement which do lack clarity, and if it were a commercial agreement, I'm not sure it would pass muster. So in particular, there seems to be a lack of recognition of the role of devolved administrations and where they have duties and where they impact. So I think there are lessons for the UK government in future trade deals, which it would appear we're going to have many in the future, that to take account of the devolved administrations and to provide clarity.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. That brings our session on this to an end. I want to thank our panellists this morning for your time. We're going to have a short break before we hear from the Cabinet Secretary. Second item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Single-Use Carrier Bags Charge Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 from the Cabinet Secretary and her officials. And I welcome Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, and the Cabinet Secretary is joined by Katrina Graham, Circular Economy Bill Manager, and Gareth Heathsides, the Circular Economy Team Leader for the Scottish Government. Good morning to you all. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to welcome you to make your statement, please.
The purpose of the regulations is quite simple: to increase the minimum charge for single-use carrier bags from 5p to 10p. This will reduce further the number of single-use carrier bags that are sold in Scotland, reduce the environmental harms and littering issues associated with them, and encourage consumers to use sustainable alternatives. There is widespread support for the proposal. In the Circular Economy Bill consultation, respondents were asked if the single-use carrier bag charge should be increased to a minimum of 10p, and 80% of all respondents said yes. It had been our intention to lay the regulations in the first half of last year, but of course the legislative timetable had to be reconsidered in light of the legislative requirements arising out of the pandemic. The most recent programme for government included a commitment to introduce legislation this parliamentary session, and the increase will also keep Scotland in line with the rest of the UK. DEFRA laid regulations on the 3rd of February to extend the single-use carrier bag charge to all retailers and to increase it to 10p with effect from 30th April 2021. We understand Wales and Northern Ireland are also considering increasing the charge. I'm conscious that the increased charge, if approved by Parliament, will overlap with the temporary exemption from the charge for home deliveries, click and collect and takeaways. The temporary exemption is a COVID-related measure and expires on 31st May 2021. It doesn't contradict our wider commitments to tackle single-use plastics and other items. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I'm looking to members if they have any questions for the Cabinet Secretary on this. Right, we'll come to Mark Ruskell first of all.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. And can I welcome this move? Just a couple of questions on this. Firstly, will there be consideration given to extending the temporary COVID extension measure to September, or is it anticipated that will actually run out in May? Secondly, just what you anticipate the impact of increasing the charge from 5 to 10p to be in terms of benefits to climate change, reduction in waste, littering, etc. And my third question is really just about why 10p. It seems like an obvious jump from 5 to 10, but was there consideration given of 15p or 20p? That's it from me, Convener.
Cabinet Secretary.
Right. To the first question, I'm sorry, I can't possibly answer that, because I suppose to a certain extent it depends entirely on where we are in the context of the pandemic. At the moment, the legislation is scheduled to, the COVID regulation is scheduled to cease on the 31st of May. I would guess that we are all hoping that can continue to be the case, but I have no inside knowledge as to whether or not it will be. So I don't think there's much I can add to that. In terms of the cost of it, we consulted on the 10p. That got 80% support from respondents. I think the higher you go, the support may begin to drift. It's a single coin. These would all be considerations in the thinking. We achieved a massive reduction with the introduction of the 5p in the first place. So I guess what we're trying not to do is take a hammer to crack a nut. At the moment, moving to 10p seems like a reasonable and widely accepted move without getting us into unnecessary, in my view, controversy, because we have already effected a massive change in the usage of these carrier bags. In respect of wider benefits, well, I did actually flag up some of them in my opening remarks. I think it's important to flag up some of the research that we've already had in terms of environmental benefits. I know that the Marine Conservation Society really saw that the 2 years following 2016, the number of carrier bags found in Scotland's beaches dropped by 40% in that space of time, with a further drop of 42% between 2018 and 2019. Obviously, there is potential evidence of an increase in what are termed bags for life, and we're going to be considering further research into that, just to check against the move into that category. But we know that there are very significant benefits. We've seen them already, and I would imagine that we will go on seeing them. I think it's worth reminding people that this doesn't just apply to single-use plastic carrier bags. This applies to all single-use. So it's not simply about plastic, because what we're trying to do here is to encourage good environmental behaviour overall.
Thank you. And we have a question from Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. It's just some clarity. I appreciate the response that the Cabinet Secretary made to me with regards to plastic liners, whatever, in deliveries. I know that the exemption charges came into force in April 2020, but expired in October 2020. Can you confirm that the exemptions on the carry bag charge for grocery collections and takeaway, there was a gap when those charges did apply between October and the new regulations coming in on the 29th of January? And if there was, can you give us some assurance that come the 31st of May, if every consideration will be given to how important it is that those at high risk and those that are vulnerable who rely on deliveries from supermarkets will be protected, and we don't have a gap in protection through that exemption we have for the plastic bags?
Well, you're now questioning me about different piece of legislation. I've said already that I hope that the 31st of May holds. I can't, in any way foresee what might or might not be the case when we will be into a brand new Parliament, and I think that I can only say that the intention would be not to allow any gaps, but I'm not in a position to be able to make any kind of commitment there. I don't know if one of the officials, Gareth, perhaps you would be able to cast your mind back in respect of the question about the gap that Finlay Carson is asking about. Can you clarify on that? That would have been the gap that Finlay has identified as possibly arising last year.
That's correct, Cabinet Secretary. So the initial exemption regulations did run out on the 3rd of October. At the time, given we're in a different situation with COVID, it was decided not to extend them because at the time things were moving back to a more normal footing in terms of deliveries. But obviously, given the new variants and the increase early in the year in the pandemic, that's why the exemption was brought back in.
Okay, that's helpful because I guess what that speaks to is the fact that it wasn't an accidental gap. If Finlay Carson was concerned about that, it wasn't somehow a situation that had been overlooked. It was a decision taken in the light of what we understood the pandemic situation to be at the time, and the way it was heading, which of course across the UK turned out not to be as optimistic as it might have been, which in a sense reinforces my caution around the 31st of May date. As much as we will hope that really is an end of the necessity for it, we've already learnt that this particular virus has surprises in store for us, and I don't want to be committing myself to something that cannot possibly be committed to. Sorry, is my phone left on?
Yeah, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, but I think it does show there was a gap because we went back into what was effectively a national lockdown on Christmas Eve or beg your pardon, on Boxing Day, but that decision not to extend exemption wasn't made until the end of January. So we've seen some of the highest rates of infection throughout the end of January and the end of December, but there wasn't a quick enough action taken to ensure that those carrier bags for delivery services were then exempt again. And I wouldn't like that seeing happen again. I would like to think the government could act to a growing situation of infections again and extend that exemption if the case arises.
Well, that wouldn't have been carelessness. There would have been specific reasons around that, and I'll need to go back into the progress of that piece of legislation and see if we can actually pin down more clarity of understanding about the progress of that, the process of all of that, and undertake to let the member, or indeed the whole committee, if the committee is interested, just to see what that particular timescale for that particular piece of legislation was.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have another question from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks. obviously the levy raises really important money for environmental projects and other initiatives. I'm just wondering if the 10p increase, will that deliver more money, or will it deliver less money because there's less use of plastic bags? And just in relation to the exemption, obviously major multiple retailers haven't had to then pay money over during this period where there's been the exemption on the 5p levy on the bags. However, have they voluntarily offered to make good on those levy payments?
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, obviously, if anybody wanted to voluntarily forward sums of money equivalent to what they might otherwise have had to use, then clearly nobody would be turning that down. I expect the situation might vary from organisation to organisation. So at the moment, we don't have any overall data about that, and we do need to remember that the reason it is a levy is because to go further than what we did would have turned it into a tax, and that was a reserved power, and we could not do that. So in terms of the money, I'm sorry, I think I'm missing a bit of question there that I've overlooked in answering the first part of it.
Yeah, you certainly answered the second part. I think the first part was around the increase, what the net benefit will be to the overall levy. Will it, because obviously like fewer people receiving 10 pence would then be buying bags, but what does that do to the levy? Does that mean there's more money coming in or less money coming in?
Well, you know, I can't model that just now because it will depend on consumer behaviour. And you know, an entirely successful scheme would probably result in no money coming in because people would simply have ceased to buy them at all. I'm hoping that the member is not suggesting that because of that we should be hoping that people will continue to buy them. We would take that as a massive success. So, you know, I think it is just one of those small ironies that at the moment the money that is being raised goes towards good causes. If there is less money raised, then it will not be available as a pot of money. But that was not the point of the levy. The point of the levy was to reduce consumer demand and the resultant harms that come from the excess use of single-use carrier bags. So the success of the levy will be a continued reduction in that single use, notwithstanding that means a reduction in money.
I'm noticing from the chat box that Gareth would like to come back in.
Oh, what have I said wrong?
No, you've not said anything wrong, Cabinet Secretary. It's just on the first point Mark Ruskell made around the continuing with the donations. So at the time of the initial exemption, we did contact retailers and ask them to maintain donations if they would. Obviously, it's their call at the end of the day, but we did make that call.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm not seeing anyone else wanting to come in, so I'm going to move on to our next agenda item. Our next item today is to invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23854 that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the Single-Use Carrier Bags Charge Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 be approved. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion. Thank you. Thank you. And if any members have any comments, now's your time to let me know. Yeah, but if you have nothing to say at this point, which is what it's looking like, if you can just indicate that you're content. Thank you. I'll now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 23854 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Right, and I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and our officials for the time this morning. Our fourth item today is consideration of the Crofton Community Right to Buy Procedures, Ballots and Forms Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021, which is a negative instrument. I believe that Angus MacDonald would like to say something.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I refer me to my register of interest. In relation to this SSI, I'm obliged to declare I own properties in a Crofton township in the Western Isles, which is on an estate that's subject to a community buyout attempt with the likelihood of a hostile buyout. However, I derive no income from these properties. Sadly.
Thank you, Angus. Can I confirm that the committee does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That's confirmed. Thank you very much, colleagues. At its next meeting on the 23rd of February, the committee will take evidence on environmental implications of the EU exit from the Cabinet Secretary, take consideration of the petitions in the remit of this committee, and will also consider a draft of our report on the updated climate change plan. And that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you.